Chapter 6. When the company had gone, I thought they never would go. Nanny said. She rushed at her brother. Blair. The boy flung up his head proudly. She told you, did she? You're engaged, cried Nanny ecstatically. Blair started. Why, he said, so I am. I never thought of it. And when he got his breath, the radiant darkness of his eyes sparkled into laughter. Yes, I'm engaged. He put his hands into his pockets and strutted the length of the room. A minute later he stopped beside the piano and struck a triumphant chord. Then he sat down and began to play uproariously, singing to a crashing accompaniment. Lived a miner, a 49er, with his daughter Clementine. Oh my darling, oh my darling. The riotous, beautiful voice rang on, the sound overflowing through the long rooms, across the hall, even into the dining room. Harris, wiping dishes in the pantry, stopped, tea towel in hand, and listened. Sarah Maitland, at her desk, lifted her head, and the pen slipped from her fingers. Blair, spinning around on the piano stool, caught his sister about her waist in a hug that made her squeak. Then they both shrieked with laughter. But Blair, Nanny said, getting her breath, shall you tell Mama tonight? Blair's face dropped. I guess I won't tell anybody yet, he faltered. Oh, that awful dinner. As the mortification of an hour ago surged back upon him, he added to the fear of telling his mother a resentment that would retaliate by secrecy. I won't tell her at all, he decided, and don't you either. I, said Nanny. Well, I should think not. Gracious. But though Blair did not tell his mother, he could not keep the great news to himself. He saw David the next afternoon, and overflowed. David took it with a gasp of silence, as if he had been suddenly hit below the belt. Then in a low voice he said, You kissed her. Did she kiss you? Blair nodded. He held his head high, balancing it a little from side to side. His lips were thrust out, his eyes shone. He was standing with his feet well apart, his hands deep in his pockets. He laughed, reddening to his forehead, but he was not embarrassed. For once David's old look of silent, friendly admiration did not answer him. Instead there was half-bewildered dismay. David wanted to protest that it wasn't fair. He did not say it, and in not saying it he ceased to be a boy. I suppose it was when you and she went off after dinner? You needn't have been so darn quiet about it. What's the good of being so mum about everything? Why didn't you come back and tell? You're not ashamed of it, are you? A man doesn't tell a thing like that, Blair said scornfully. Well, David snorted, I suppose sometime you'll be married? Blair nodded again. Right off. Said David, your mother won't let you. You are only 16. Don't be an ass. I'll be 17 next May. 17. What's 17? I'm pretty near 18, and I haven't thought of being married, at least to anybody in particular. You couldn't, Blair said coldly. You haven't got the cash. David chewed this bitter fact in silence. Then he said, I thought you and Elizabeth were kind of off at dinner. You didn't talk to each other at all. I thought you were both huffy, and instead of that David paused. That damn dinner, Blair said, dropping his love affair for his grievance. Blair's toga virilis, assumed in that hot moment in the hall, was profanity of sorts. David, I'm going to clear out. I can't stand this sort of thing. I'll go and live at a hotel till I go to college. Thought you were going to get married? David interrupted him viciously. Blair looked at him, and suddenly understood. David was jealous. Gory, he said blankly. He was honestly dismayed. Look here, he began, I didn't know that you. I don't know what you're talking about, David broke in contemptuously. If you think I care, one way or the other, you're mistaken. It's nothing to me. Bye, and he turned on his heel. It was a hot July afternoon. The sun-baked street along which they had been walking was deep with black dust and full of the clamor of traffic. 4 big grey Flemish horses, straining against their breastplates, were hauling a dray loaded with clattering iron rods. The sound, familiar enough to any Mercer boy, seemed to David at that moment intolerable. I'll get out of this cursed noise, he said to himself, and turned down a narrow street toward the river. It occurred to him that he would go over the covered bridge, and maybe stop and get a tumbler of ice cream at Mrs. Tidd's. Then he would strike out into the country and take a walk. He had nothing else to do. This vacation business wasn't all it was cracked up to be. A man had better fun at school. He was sick of Mercer, anyhow. He had reached Mrs. Tidd's saloon by that time, and through the white palings of the fence he had glimpses of happy couples sitting at marble-topped tables among the marigolds and corpses, taking slow, delicious spoonfuls of ice cream and gazing at each other with languishing eyes. David felt a qualm of disgust. For the first time in his life he had no desire for ice cream. A boy like Blair might find it pleasant to eat ice cream with a lot of fellows and girls out in the garden of a toll house, with people looking in through the palings, but he had outgrown such things. The idea of Blair, at his age, talking about being in love. Blair didn't know what love meant. And as for Elizabeth, how could she fall in love with Blair? He was 2 months younger than she, to begin with. No woman ought to marry a man younger than she is, David said. He himself, he reflected, was much older than Elizabeth. That was how it ought to be. The girl should always be younger than the fellow. And anyway, Blair wasn't the kind of man for a girl like Elizabeth to marry. He wouldn't understand her. Elizabeth goes off at half-cock sometimes, and Blair wouldn't know how to handle her. I understand her perfectly. Besides that, he's too selfish. A woman ought not to marry a selfish man, said David. However, it made no difference to him whom she married. If Elizabeth liked that sort of thing, if she found Blair, who was only a baby anyhow, the kind of man she could love, why then he was disappointed in Elizabeth. That was all. He was not jealous, or anything like that. He was just disappointed. He was sorry that Elizabeth was that kind of girl. Very, very sorry, David said to himself, and his eyes stung. Ah, well, one may smile, but the pangs are real enough to the calf. The trouble with us is we have forgotten our own pangs, so we doubt his. Yes, David was sorry, but the whole darn business was nothing to him, because, unlike Blair, he was not a boy, and he could not waste time over women. He had his future to think of. In fact, he felt that to make the most of himself he must never marry. Then suddenly these bitter forecastings ceased. He had come upon some boys who were throwing stones at the dust-grimed windows of an unused foundry shed. Along the roof of the big, gaunt building, dilapidated and deserted, was a vast line of lights that had long been a target for every boy who could pick up a pebble. Glass lay in splinters on the slope of sheet iron below the sashes, and one could look in through yawning holes at silent, shadowy spaces that had once roared with light from swinging ladles and flowing cupolas, but there were a few whole panes left yet. At the sound of crashing glass, David, being a human boy, stopped and looked on, at first with his hands in his pockets, then he picked up a stone himself. A minute later he was yelling and smashing with the rest of them, but when he had broken a couple of lights, curiously enough, desire failed. He felt a sudden distaste for breaking windows, and for everything else. It was a sort of spiritual nausea, and life was black and bitter on his tongue. He was conscious of an actual sinking below his breastbone. "I'm probably coming down with brain fever," he told himself, and he had a happy moment of thinking how wretched everybody would be when he died. Elizabeth would be very wretched. David felt a wave of comfort, and on the impulse of expected death, he turned toward home again. However, if he should by any chance recover, marriage was not for him. It occurred to him that this would be a bitter surprise to Elizabeth, whose engagement would of course be broken as soon as she heard of his illness, and again he felt happier. No, he would never marry. He would give his life to his profession. It had long ago been decided that David was to be a doctor. But it would be a lonely life. He looked ahead and saw himself a great physician, no common doctor, like that old Dr. King who came sometimes to see his mother, but a great man, dying nobly in some awful epidemic. When Elizabeth heard of his magnificent courage, she'd feel pretty badly. Rather different from Blair. How much finer than to be merely looking forward to a lot of money that somebody else had made. But perhaps that was why Elizabeth liked Blair, because he was going to have money? And yet, how could she compare Blair with, well, any fellow who meant to work his own way? Here David touched bottom abruptly. How can a fellow take money he hasn't earned? He said to himself. David's feeling about independence was unusual in a boy of his years, and it was not altogether admirable. It was, in fact, one of those qualities that is a virtue, unless it becomes a vice. When he was halfway across the bridge, he stopped to look down at the slow, turbid river rolling below him. He stood there a long time, leaning on the handrail. On the dun surface a sheen of oil gathered and spread and gathered again. He could hear the wash of the current, and in the railing under his hand he felt the old wooden structure thrill and quiver in the constant surge of water against the pier below him. The sun, a blood-red disk, was slipping into the deepening haze, and on either side of the river the city was darkening into dusk. All along the shore lights were pricking out of the twilight and sending wavering shafts down into the water. The coiling smoke from furnace chimneys lay level and almost motionless in the still air. Sometimes it was shot with sparks, or showed, on its bellying black curves, red gleams from hidden fires below. David, staring at the river with absent, angry eyes, stopped his miserable thoughts to watch a steamboat coming down the current. Its smokestacks were folded back for passing under the bridge, and its great paddle wheel scarcely moved except to get steerage way. It was pushing a dozen rafts, all lashed together into a spreading sheet. The smell of the fresh planks pierced the acrid odor of soot that was settling down with the night mists. On one of the rafts was a shanty of newly sawed pine boards. It had no windows, but it was evidently a home, for a stovepipe came through its roof, and there was a woman sitting in its little doorway, nursing her baby. David, looking down, saw the downy head and a little crumpled fist lying on the white, bare breast. The woman, looking up as they floated below him, caught his eye, and drew her blue cotton dress across her bosom. David suddenly put his hand over his lips to hide their quiver. The abrupt tears were on his cheeks. "Oh, Elizabeth," he said. The revolt, the anger, the jealousy were all gone. He sobbed under his breath. He had forgotten that he had said it made no difference to him, not the slightest difference. It did make a difference. All the difference in the world. Oh, Elizabeth. The barges had slid farther and farther under the bridge. The woman and the child were out of sight. The steamboat with its folded smokestacks slid after them, leaving a wake of rocking, yellow foam. The water splashed loudly against the piers. It was nearly dark there on the footpath and quite deserted. David put his head down on his arms on the railing and stood motionless for a long moment. When he reached home, he found his mother in the twilight, in the little garden behind the house. David, standing behind her, said carelessly, "I have some news for you, Materna." "Yes?" she said, absorbed in pinching back her lemon verbena. "Blair is spoony over Elizabeth. Here, I'll snip that thing for you." Mrs. Ritchie faced him in amazement. "What? Why, but they are both children," and she stopped and looked at him. "Oh, David," she said. And the boy, forgetting the spying windows of the opposite houses, dropped his head on her shoulder. "Materna, Materna," he said, in a stifled voice. Chapter 7. Nobody except David took the childish love affair very seriously, not even the principals, especially not Elizabeth. David did not see her for a day or two, except out of the corner of his eye when, during the new and still secret rite of shaving, for David was willing to shed his blood to prove that he was a man, he looked out of his bedroom window and saw her down in the garden helping her uncle feed his pigeons. He did not want to see her. He was younger than his years, this honest-eyed, inexpressive fellow of 17, but for all his youth he was hard hit. He grew abruptly older that first week. He didn't sleep well. He even looked a little pale under his freckles, and his mother worried over his appetite. When she asked him what was the matter, he said, listlessly, nothing. They were very intimate friends, these two, but that moment on the bridge marked the beginning of the period, known to all mothers of sons, of the boy's temporary retreat into himself. When a day or two later David saw Elizabeth, or rather when she, picking a bunch of heliotrope in her garden, saw him through the open door in the wall, and called to him to come, right over. As fast as your legs can carry you. He was, she thought, very queer. He came in answer to the summons, but he had nothing to say. She, however, was bubbling over with talk. She took his hand, and, running with him into the arbor, pulled him down on the seat beside her. "David, where on earth have you been all this time? David, have you heard? I suppose you mean about you and Blair?" he said. He did not look at her, but he watched a pencil of sunshine, piercing the leaves overhead, faintly gilding the bunches of green grapes that had a film of soot on their greenness, and then creeping down to rest on the heliotrope in her lap. "Yes," said Elizabeth. "Isn't it the most exciting thing you ever heard? David, I want to show you something." She peered out through the leaves to make sure that they were unobserved. "It's a terrific secret," she said, her eyes dancing. Her fingers were at her throat, fumbling with the fastening of her dress, which caught and had to be pulled open with a jerk. Then she drew halfway from her young bosom a ring hanging on a black silk thread. She bent forward a little, so that he might see it. "I keep it down in there so Cherry Pie won't know," she whispered. "Look." David looked and looked away. Elizabeth, with a blissful sigh, dropped the ring back again into the warm whiteness of that secret place. "Isn't it perfectly lovely? It's my engagement ring. I'm so excited." David was silent. "Why, David Ritchie, you don't care a bit?" "Why, yes, I do," he said. He took a grape from a bunch beside him, rubbed the soot off on his trousers, and ate it, then blinked wryly. "Gory, that's sour. You don't like my engagement?" Elizabeth declared slowly. Reproachful tears stood in her eyes. She fastened her dress with indignant fingers. "I think you are perfectly horrid not to be sympathetic. It's very important to a girl to get engaged and have a ring." "It's very pretty," David managed to say. "Pretty? I should say it was pretty. It cost $50. Blair said so." "David, what on earth is the matter? Don't you like me being engaged?" "Oh, it's all right," he evaded. He shut his eyes, which were still watering from that sour grape, but even with closed eyes he saw again that soft place where Blair's ring hung, warm and secret. The pain below his own breastbone was very bad for a minute, and the hot fragrance of the heliotrope seemed overpowering. He swallowed hard, then looked at one of Mr. Ferguson's pigeons, walking almost into the arbor. The pigeon stopped, hesitated, cocked a ruby eye on the two humans on the wooden seat, and fluttered back into the sunny garden. "Why, you mind?" Elizabeth said, aghast. "Oh, it's nothing to me," David managed to say. "Course, I don't care. Only I didn't know you liked Blair so much, so it was a surprise," he said miserably. Elizabeth's consternation was beyond words. There was a perceptible moment before she could find anything to say. "Why, I never dreamed you'd mind. David, truly, I like you best of any boy I know. Only, of course now, being engaged to Blair, I have to like him best." "Yes, that's so," David admitted. "Truly, I like you dreadfully, David. If I'd supposed you'd mind, but, oh, David, it's so interesting to be engaged. I really can't stop. I'd have to give him back my ring," she said in an agonized voice. She pressed her hand against her breast, and poor David's eyes followed the ardent gesture. "It's all right," he said with a gulp. Elizabeth was ready to cry. She dropped her head on his shoulder and began to bemoan herself. "Why on earth didn't you say something? How could I know? How stupid you are, David. If I'd known you minded, I'd just as lief have been engaged to." Elizabeth stopped short. She sat up very straight, and put her hand to the neck of her dress to make sure it was fastened. At that moment a new sense was born in her. For the first time since they had known each other, her straightforward eyes, the sexless eyes of a child, faltered, and refused to meet David's. "I think maybe Cherry Pie wants me now," she said shyly, and slipped away, leaving David mournfully eating green grapes in the arbor. This was the last time that Elizabeth, uninvited, put her head on a boy's shoulder. A week later she confided to Miss White the great fact of her engagement, but she was not so excited about it by that time. For one thing, she had received her uncle's present of a locket, so the ring was not her only piece of jewelry, and besides that, since her talk with David, being engaged, had seemed less interesting. However, Miss White felt it her duty to drop a hint of what had happened to Mr. Ferguson. Had it struck him that perhaps Blair Maitland was thinking about Elizabeth? "Thinking what about her?" Mr. Ferguson said, lifting his head from his papers with a fretted look. "Why," said Miss White, "as I am always at my post, sir, I have opportunities for observing. In fact, I shouldn't wonder if they were attached." Cherry Pie would have felt that a more definite word was indelicate. "Of course I don't exactly know it," said Miss White, faithful to Elizabeth's confidence, "but I recall that when I was a young lady, young gentlemen did become attached to other young ladies." "Love making? At her age? I won't have it," said Robert Ferguson. The old, apprehensive look darkened in his face. His feeling for the child was so strangely shadowed by his fear that life would play another trick on him, and Elizabeth would disappoint him some way, that he could not take Cherry Pie's information with any appreciation of its humor. "Send her to me," he said. "Mr. Ferguson," poor old Miss White ventured, "if I might suggest, it would be well to be very kind, because..." Kind? Said Robert Ferguson, astonished. He gave an angry thrust at the black ribbon of his glasses that brought them tumbling from his nose. Was I unkind? I will see her in the library after supper. Miss White nibbled at him speechlessly. If he is severe with her, I don't know what she won't do, she said to herself. But Mr. Ferguson did not mean to be severe. When Elizabeth presented herself in his library, the interview began calmly enough. Her uncle was brief and to the point, but he was not unkind. She and Blair were too young to be engaged. Don't think of it again, he commanded. Elizabeth looked tearful, but she did not resent his dictum. David's lack of sympathy had been very dampening to romance. It was just at the end that the gunpowder flared. Now, remember, I don't want you to be foolish, Elizabeth. I don't think being in love is foolish, uncle. Love? What do you know about love? You are nothing but a silly little girl. I don't think I'm very little, and Blair is in love with me. Blair is as young and as foolish as you are. Even if you were older, I wouldn't allow it. He is selfish and irresponsible and... I think, interrupted Elizabeth, that you are very mean to abuse Blair behind his back. It isn't fair. Her uncle was perfectly dumbfounded, then he went into harsh reproof. Elizabeth grew whiter and whiter and the dimple in her cheek lengthened into a long hairline. I wish I didn't live with you. I wish my mother were alive. She would be good to me. Your mother? Said Robert Ferguson. His involuntary grunt of cynical amusement touched the child like a whip. Her fury was appalling. She screamed at him that she hated him. She loved her mother. She was going to marry Blair the minute she was grown up. Then she whirled out of the room, almost knocking over poor old Miss White, whose post had been anxiously near the keyhole. Upstairs, her rage scared her governess nearly to death. My lamb. You'll get overheated and take cold. When I was a young lady, it was thought unrefined to speak so emphatically. And your dear uncle didn't mean to be severe, he... Dear uncle, said Elizabeth, dear devil. He hurt my feelings. He made fun of my mother. As she spoke, she leaped at a photograph of Robert Ferguson which stood on her bureau, and, doubling her hand, struck the thin glass with all her force. It splintered, and the blood spurted from her cut knuckles onto her uncle's face. Miss White began to cry. Oh, my dear, try to control yourself, or you'll do something dreadful someday. Cherry Pie's efforts to check Elizabeth's temper were like the protesting twitterings of a sparrow in a thunderstorm. When she reproved her now, the furious little creature, wincing and trying to check the bleeding with her handkerchief, did not even take the trouble to reply. Later, of course, the inevitable moment of penitence came, but it was not because she had lost her temper. Loss of temper was always a trifling matter to Elizabeth. It was because she had been disrespectful to her uncle's picture. That night, when all the household was in bed, she slipped downstairs, candle in hand, to the library. On the mantelpiece was a photograph of herself. She took it out of the frame, tore it into little bits, stamped on it, grinding her heel down on her own young face. Then she took off the locket Mr. Ferguson had given her, a most simple affair of pearls and turquoise, kissed it with passion, and looked about her. Where should it be offered up? The ashes in the fireplace? No, the housemaid would find it there. Then she had an inspiration, the deep well of her uncle's battered old inkstand. Oh, to blacken the pearls, to stain the heavenly blue of the turquoise. It was almost too frightful. But it was right. She had hurt his feelings by saying she wished she didn't have to live with him, and she had insulted his dear picture. So, with a tearful hiccup, she dropped the locket into the ink pot that stood between the feet of a spattered bronze Socrates, and watched it sink into a black and terrible grave. I'm glad not to have it, she said, and felt that she had squared matters with her conscience. As for Robert Ferguson, he did not notice that the photograph had disappeared, nor did he plunge his pen deep enough to find a pearl, nor understand the significance of the bound-up hand, but the old worry about her came back again. Her mother had defended her own wicked love affair, with all the violence of a selfish woman, and in his panic of apprehension, poor little Elizabeth's defense of Blair seemed to be of the same nature. He was so worried over it that he was moved to do a very unwise thing. He would, he said to himself, put Mrs. Maitland on her guard about this nonsense between the two children. The next morning when he went into her office at the works, he found the place humming with business. As he entered, he met a foreman, just taking his departure with, so to speak, his tail between his legs. The man was scarlet to his forehead under the lash of his employer's tongue. It had been administered in the inner room, but the door was open into the large office, and as Mrs. Maitland had not seen fit to modulate her voice, the clerks and some messenger boys and a couple of traveling men had had the benefit of it. Ferguson, reporting at that open door, was bidden curtly to come in and sit down. "I'll see you presently," she said, and burst out into the large office. Instantly the room full of people, lounging about waiting their turn, came to attention. She rushed in among them like a gale, whirling away the straws and chaff before her, and leaving only the things that were worthwhile. She snapped a yellow envelope from a boy's hand, and even while she was ripping it open with a big forefinger, she was reading the card of an astonished traveling man. "No, sir. No, sir. Your bid was 1/2 of 1% over Heinz. Your people been customers so long that they thought that I never mix business and friendship." She stood still long enough to run her eye over the drawing of a patent, and toss it back to the would-be inventor. "No, I don't care to take it up with you." "Cast it for you? Certainly. I'll cast anything for anybody," and the man found his blueprint in his hand before he could begin his explanation. "What, Johnson wants to know where to get the new housing to replace the one that broke yesterday? Tell Johnson that's what I pay him to decide. I have no time to do his business for him, my own is all I can attend to." "Mr. Ferguson," she called out, as she came banging back into the private office, "what about that order that came in yesterday?" She sat down at her desk and listened intently to a somewhat intricate statement involving manufacturing matters dependent upon the quality of certain shipments of ore. Then, abruptly she gave her orders. Robert Ferguson, making notes as rapidly as he could, smiled with satisfaction at the power of it all. It was as ruthless and as admirable as a force of nature. She would not pause, this woman, for flesh and blood. She was as impersonal as one of her own great shears that would bite off a bloom or a man's head with equal precision, and in doing so would be fulfilling the law of its being. Assuredly she would stop Blair's puppy love in short order. Business over, Sarah Maitland leaned back in her chair and laughed. "Did you hear me blowing Dale up? I guess he'll stay put for a while now. But I'm afraid I was angry," she confessed sheepishly, "and there is nothing on earth so foolish as to be angry at a fool." "There is nothing on earth so irritating as a fool," he said. "Yes, but it's absurd to waste your temper on M. I always say to myself, Sarah Maitland, if he had your brains, he'd have your job. That generally keeps me cool. But I'm afraid I shall never learn to suffer Mr. Distick's friends, gladly. Read your Bible, and you'll know where that comes from. I tell you, friend Ferguson, you ought to thank God every day that you weren't born a fool, and so ought I. Well, what can I do for you? I am bothered about Elizabeth and Blair." She looked at him blankly for a moment. "Elizabeth? Blair? What about? Elizabeth and Blair? It appears," Robert Ferguson said, and shoved the door shut with his foot, "it appears that there has been some love-making." "Love-making?" she repeated, bewildered. "Blair has been talking to Elizabeth," he explained. "I believe they call themselves engaged." Mrs. Maitland flung her head back with a loud laugh. At the shock of such a sound in such a place, one of the clerks in the other room spun round on his stool, and Mrs. Maitland, catching sight of him through the glass partition, broke the laugh off in the middle. "Well, upon my word," she said. "Of course it's all nonsense, but it must be stopped." "Why?" said Mrs. Maitland, and her superintendent felt a jar of astonishment. "They are children. Blair is 16, his mother said thoughtfully. If he thinks he is in love with Elizabeth, it will help to make a man of him. Furthermore, I'd rather have him make love than make pictures. That is his last fancy," she said, frowning. "I don't know how he comes by it. Of course, my husband did paint sometimes, I admit, but he never wanted to make a business of it. He was no fool, I can tell you, if he did make pictures." Robert Ferguson said dryly that he didn't think she need worry about Blair. "He has neither industry nor humility," he said, "and you can't be an artist without both of them. But as for this love business, they are children." Mrs. Maitland was not listening. "To be in love will be steadying him while he's at college. If he sticks to Elizabeth till he graduates, I shan't object." "I shall object." But she did not notice his protest. She has more temper than is quite comfortable, she ruminated. But, after all, to a young man being engaged is like having a dog. One dog does as well as another, one girl does as well as another. And it isn't as if Blair had to consider whether his wife would be a good manager, as they say. He'll have enough to waste, if he wants to. He'll have more than he knows what to do with. There was a little proud bridling of her head. She, who had never wasted a cent in her life, had made it possible for her boy to be as wasteful as he pleased. Yes, she said, with the quick decision which was so characteristic of her, yes, he can have her. No, he can't, said Elizabeth's uncle. What? She said, in frank surprise. Blair will have too much money. Inherited wealth is the biggest handicap a man can have. Too much money? She chuckled. Your bearings are getting hot, ain't they? Come, I'm not so sure you need thank God. How can a man have too much money? That's nonsense. She banged her hand down on the call bell on her desk. Evans, bring me the drawings for those channels. I tell you I won't have it, Robert Ferguson repeated. I mean the blueprints. Mrs. Maitland commanded loudly. You have no sense, Evans. Ferguson got up. She had a way of not hearing when she was spoken to that made a man hot along his backbone. Robert Ferguson was hot, but he meant to have the last word. He paused at the door and looked back. I shall not allow it. Good day, Mr. Ferguson, said his employer, deep in the blueprints. Chapter 8. Elizabeth's uncle need not have concerned himself so seriously about the affairs of Elizabeth's heart. The very next day the rift between the lovers began. What on earth have you done to your hand? Asked Blair. I cut it. I was angry at uncle, and broke his picture, and... Blair shouted with laughter. Oh, Elizabeth, what a goose you are. That's just the way you used to bite your arm when you were mad. You always did cut off your nose to spite your face. Where is your locket? None of your business, said Elizabeth savagely. It was easy to be savage with Blair, because David's lack of interest in her affairs had taken the zest out of being engaged, in the most surprising way. But she had no intention of not being engaged. Romance was too flattering to self-love to be relinquished. Nevertheless, after the first week or two she lapsed easily, in moments of forgetfulness, into the old matter-of-fact squabbling and the healthy unreasonableness natural to lifelong acquaintance. The only difference was that now, when she and Blair squabbled, they made up again in new ways. Blair, with gusts of what Elizabeth, annoyed and a little disgusted, called silliness, Elizabeth, with strange, half-scared, wholly joyous moments of conscious power. But the making up was far less personal than the fallings out. These, at least, meant individual antagonisms, whereas the reconciliations were something larger than the girl and boy, something which bore them on its current as a river bears straws upon its breast. But they played with that mighty current as thoughtlessly as all young creatures play with it. Elizabeth used to take her engagement ring from the silk thread about her neck, and, putting it on her finger, dance up and down her room, her right hand on her hip, her left stretched out before her so that she could see the sparkle of the tiny diamond on her third finger. I'm engaged, she would sing to herself. Oh, isn't it joyful, joyful, joyful. Blair's in love with me. The words were so glorious that she really remembered to add, I'm in love with Blair. The fact was, Blair was merely a necessary appendage to the joy of being engaged. When he irritated her by what she called silliness, she was often frankly disagreeable to him. As for Blair, he, too, had his ups and downs. He swaggered, and threw his shoulders back, and cast appraising eyes on women generally, and thought deeply on marriage. But of Elizabeth he thought very little. Because she was a girl, she bored him quite as often as he bored her. It was because she was a woman that there came those moments when he offended her, and in those moments she had but little personality to him. In fact, their love affair, so far as they understood it, apart from its elemental impulses which they did not understand, was as much of a play to them as the apple tree housekeeping had been. So Mr. Ferguson might have spared himself the unpleasant interview with Blair's mother. He recognized this himself before long, and was even able to relax into a difficult smile when Mrs. Ritchie ventured a mild pleasantry on the subject. For Mrs. Ritchie had spoken to Blair, and understood the situation so well that she could venture a pleasantry. She had sounded him one evening in the darkness of her narrow garden. David was not at home, and Blair was glad of the chance to wait for him, so long as Mrs. Ritchie let him lounge on the grass at her feet. His adoration of David's mother, begun in his childhood, had strengthened with his years, perhaps because she was all that his own mother was not. "Blair," she said, "of course you and I both realize that Elizabeth is only a child, and you are entirely too wise to talk seriously about being engaged to her. She is far too young for that sort of thing. Of course you understand that?" And Blair, feeling as though the sword of manhood had been laid on his shoulder, and instantly forgetting the smaller pride of being engaged, said in a very mature voice, "Oh, certainly I understand. If, in the dusk of stars and fireflies, with the fragrance of white stalks blossoming near the stone bench that circled the old hawthorn tree in the middle of the garden, if at that moment Mrs. Ritchie had demanded Elizabeth's head upon a charger, Blair would have rejoiced to offer it. But this serene and gentle woman was far too wise to wring any promise from the boy, although, indeed, she had no opportunity, for at that moment Mr. Ferguson knocked on the green door between the two gardens and asked if he might come in and smoke his cigar in his neighbor's garden. "I'll smoke the aphids of your rose bushes," he offered. "You are very careless about your roses?" "A bad tenant," said Mrs. Ritchie, smiling. And poor Blair picked himself up, and went sulkily off. But Mrs. Ritchie's flattering assumption that Blair and she looked at things in the same way, and David's apparent indifference to Elizabeth's emotions, made the childish love affair wholesomely commonplace on both sides. By mid-September it was obvious that the prospect of college was attractive to Blair, and that the moment of parting would not be tragic to Elizabeth. The romance did not come to a recognized end, however, until a day or two before Blair started east. The four friends, and Miss White, had gone out to Mrs. Tidd's, where David had stood treat, and after their tumblers of pink and brown and white ice cream had been emptied, and Mrs. Todd had made her usual joke about good-looking couples, they had taken 2 skiffs for a slow drift down the river to Willis's. When they were rowing home again, the skiffs at first kept abreast, but gradually, in spite of Miss White's desire to be at her post, and David's entire willingness to hold back, Blair and Elizabeth appropriately fell behind, with only a little shaggy dog, which Elizabeth had lately acquired, to play propriety. In the yellow September afternoon the river ran placidly between the hills and low-lying meadows. Here and there, high on a wooded hillside, a maple flamed among the greenness of the walnuts and locusts, or the chestnuts showed the bronze beginnings of autumn. Ahead of them the sunshine had melted into an umber haze, which in the direction of Mercer deepened into a smudge of black. Elizabeth was twisting her left hand about to get different lights on her ring, which she had managed to slip on her finger when Cherry Pie was not looking. Blair, with absent eyes, was singing under his breath. "Oh, I came to a river, and I couldn't get across. Sing, Polly Wolly Doodle all the day. And I jumped upon a nigger, and I thought he was a horse. Sing Polly Wolly." Horrid old hole, Mercer, he broke off, resting on his oars and letting the boat slip back on the current. "I like Mercer," Elizabeth said, ceasing to admire the ring. "Since you've come home from boarding school you don't like anything but the East." She began to stroke her puppy's head violently. Blair was silent. He was looking at a willow dipping its swaying fingertips in the water. "Blair, why don't you answer me?" Blair, plainly bored, said, "Well, I don't like hideousness and dirt." "David likes Mercer." "I bet Mrs. Ritchie doesn't," Blair murmured, and began to row lazily. "Oh, Mrs. Ritchie," cried Elizabeth. "You think whatever she thinks is about perfect." "Well, isn't it?" Elizabeth's lip hardened. "I suppose you think she's perfect too?" "I do," Blair said. "She thinks I'm dreadful because, sometimes, I get provoked." Elizabeth said angrily. "Well, you are," Blair agreed calmly. "If I am so wicked, I wonder you want to be engaged to me." "Can't I like anybody but you?" Blair said, and yawned. "You can like everybody, for all I care," she retorted. Blair whistled, upon which Elizabeth became absorbed in petting her dog, kissing him ardently between his eyes. "I hate to see a girl kiss a dog," Blair observed. "Sing Polly Wolly Do." "Don't look," then, said Elizabeth, and kissed Bobby again. Blair sighed, and gave up his song. Bobby, obviously uncomfortable, scrambled out of Elizabeth's lap and began to stretch himself on the uncertain floor of the skiff. "Lie down," Blair commanded, and poked the little creature, not ungently, with his foot. Bobby yelped, gave a flying nip at his ankle, and retreated to the shelter of his mistress's skirts. "Confound that dog!" cried Blair. "You are a horrid boy," she said, consoling her puppy with frantic caresses. "I'm glad he bit you." Blair, rubbing his ankle, said he'd like to throw the little wretch overboard. Well, of course, Elizabeth being Elizabeth, the result was inevitable. The next instant the ring lay sparkling in the bottom of the boat. "I break my engagement. Take your old ring. You are a cruel, wicked boy, and I hate you, so there?" "I must say I don't see why you should expect me to enjoy being bitten," Blair said hotly. "Well, all right. Throw me over, if you want to. I shall never trust a woman again as long as I live." He began to row fiercely. "I only hope that darn pup isn't going mad." "I hope he is going mad," said Elizabeth, trembling all over, "and I hope you'll go mad, too. Put me on shore this instant. Considering the current, I fear you will have to endure my society for several instants," Blair said. "I'd rather be drowned," she cried furiously, and as she spoke, even before he could raise his hand to stop her, with Bobby in her arms she sprang lightly over the side of the boat into the water. There was a terrific splash, but, alas, Elizabeth, in preferring death to Blair's society, had not calculated upon the September shallows, and even before the horrified boy could drop his oars and spring to her assistance, she was on her feet, standing knee-deep in the muddy current. The water completely extinguished the fires of wrath. In the hubbub that followed, the ejaculations and outcries, Nanny's tears, Miss White's terrified scolding, Blair's protestations to David that it wasn't his fault, through it all, Elizabeth, wading ashore, was silent. Only at the landing of the toll house, when poor distracted Cherry Pie bade the boys get a carriage, did she speak. "I won't go in a carriage. I am going to walk home." "My lamb, you'll take cold. You mustn't." "You look like the deuce," Blair told her anxiously, and David blurted out, "Elizabeth, you can't walk home. You're a perfect object." Elizabeth, through the mud trickling over her eyes, flashed a look at him. "That's why I'm going to walk." And walk she did, across the bridge, along the street, a dripping little figure stared at by passers-by, and followed by the faithful but embarrassed 4 by 5, indeed, for Blair had fished Bobby out of the water, and even stopped, once in a while when no one was looking, to give the maker of all this trouble a furtive and apologetic pat. At Elizabeth's door, in a very scared frame of mind lest Mr. Ferguson should come out and catch him, Blair attempted to apologize. "Don't be silly," Elizabeth said, muddy and shivering, "but just, it wasn't your fault. But we're not engaged anymore." And that was the end of the love story. Elizabeth told Cherry Pie that she had broken with Blair Maitland forever. Miss White, when she went to make her report of the dreadful event to Mr. Ferguson, added that she felt assured the young people had got over their foolishness. Elizabeth's uncle, telling the story of the ducking to David's horrified mother, said that he was greatly relieved to know that Elizabeth had come to her senses. But with all the tellings that buzzed between the three households, nobody thought of telling Mrs. Maitland. Why should they? Who would connect this woman of iron and toil and sweat, of noise and motion, with the sentimentalities of 2 children? She had to find it out for herself. At breakfast on the morning of the day Blair was to start east, his mother, looking over the top of her newspaper at him, said abruptly, "Blair, I have something to say to you before you go. Be at my office at the works at 10:15. She looked at him amiably, then pushed back her chair. "Nanny, get my bonnet. Come, hurry. I'm late." Nanny, running, brought the bonnet, a bunch of rusty black crepe, with strings frayed with many tyings. "Oh, Mamma," she said softly, "do let me get you a new bonnet?" But Mrs. Maitland was not listening. "Harris," she called loudly, "tell Watson to have those roller figures for me at 11. And I want the linen tracing. Bates will know what I mean, at noon without fail. Nanny, see that there's boiled cabbage for dinner." A moment later the door banged behind her. The abrupt silence was like a blow. Nanny and Harris caught their breaths. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the air. There was a minute before anyone breathed freely. Then Blair flung up his arms in a wordless protest. He actually winced with pain. He glanced around the unlovely room, at the table, with its ledgers and clutter of unmatched china, old Canton, and heavy white earthenware, and odd cups and saucers with splashing decorations which had pleased Harris's eye, at the files of newspapers on the sideboard, the grimy walls, the untidy fireplace. "Thank heaven. I'm going off today. I wish I need never come back," he said. "Oh, Blair, that is a dreadful thing to say." "It may be dreadful, but that's the way I feel. I can't help my feelings, can I? The further Mother and I are apart, the better we love each other. Well, I suppose I've got to go and see her bossing a lot of men, instead of sitting at home, like a lady, and I'll get a dreadful blowing up. Of course she knows about the engagement now, thanks to Elizabeth's craziness." "I don't believe she knows anything about it," Nanny tried to encourage him. "Oh, you bet old Ferguson has told her," Blair said, gloomily. "Say, Nanny, if Elizabeth doesn't look out she'll get into awful hot water one of these days with her devil of a temper, and she'll get other people into it, too," he ended resentfully. Blair hated hot water, as he hated everything that was unbeautiful. "Mother is going to take my head off, of course," he said. But Sarah Maitland, entirely ignorant of what had happened, had no such intention. She had gone over to her office in a glow of personal pleasure that warmed up the details of business. She intended to take Blair that morning through the works, not as he had often gone before, tagging after her, a frightened child, a reluctant boy, but as the prince, formally looking over the kingdom into which he was so soon to come. He was in love, therefore he would wish to be married, therefore he would be impatient to get to work. It was all a matter of logical and satisfactory deduction. How many times in this hot summer, when very literally she was earning her son's bread by the sweat of her brow, had she looked at Elizabeth and Blair and found enjoyment in these deductions? Nobody would have imagined it, but the big, ungainly woman dreamed. Dreamed of her boy, of his business success, of his love, of his wife, and, who knows? Perhaps those grimy pink baby socks began to mean something more personal than the missionary barrel. It was her purpose, on this particular morning, to tell him, after they had gone through the works, just where, when he graduated, he was to begin. Not at the bottom. That was Ferguson's idea. He ought to start at the bottom, if he is ever to get to the top, Ferguson had barked. No, Blair need not start at the bottom, he could begin pretty well up at the top, and he should have a salary. What an incentive that would be! First she would tell him that now, when he was going to college, she meant to increase his allowance, then she would tell him about the salary he would have when he got to work. How happy he would be. For a boy to be in love, and have all the pocket money he wanted, and a great business to look forward to have work. The finest thing in the world, all ready to his hand, what more could a human being desire? At the office, she swept through the morning business with a speed that took her people off their feet. Once or twice she glanced at the clock. Blair was always unpunctual. He'll get that knocked out of him when he gets into business, she thought, grimly. It was 11 before he came loitering across the yards. His mother, lifting her head for a moment from her desk, and glancing impatiently out of the dirt-begrimed office window, saw him coming, and caught the gleam of his patent leather shoes as he skirted a puddle just outside the door. "Well, Master Blair," she said to herself, flinging down her pen, "you'll forget those pretty boots when you get to walking around your works." Blair, dawdling through the outer office, found his way to her sanctum and sat down in a chair beside her desk. He glanced at her shrinkingly, and looked away. Her bonnet was crooked, her hair was hanging in wisps at the back of her neck, her short skirt showed the big, broad-soled foot twisted round the leg of her chair. Blair saw the muddy sole of that shoe, and half closed his eyes. Then remembering Elizabeth, he felt a little sick. "She's going to row about it," he thought, and quailed. "You're late," she said. Then, without stopping for his excuses, she proceeded with the business in hand. "I'm going to increase your allowance." Blair sat up in astonishment. "I mean while you're at college. After that I shall stop the allowance entirely, and you will go to work. You will go on a salary, like any other man." Her mouth clicked shut in a tight line of satisfaction. The color flew into Blair's face. "Why," he said, "you are awfully good, Mother. Really, I know all about this business of your engagement to Elizabeth," Mrs. Maitland broke in, "though you didn't see fit to tell me about it yourself." There was something in her voice that would have betrayed her to any other hearer. But Blair, who was sensitive to Mrs. Ricci's slightest wish, and careful of old Cherry Pie's comfort, and generously thoughtful even of Harris, Blair, absorbed in his own apprehensions, heard no pain in his mother's voice. "I know all about it," Mrs. Maitland went on. "I won't have you call yourselves engaged until you are out of college, of course. But I have no objection to your looking forward to being engaged, and married, too. It's a good thing for a young man to expect to be married. Keeps him clean." Blair was struck dumb. Evidently, though she did not know what had happened, she did know that he had been engaged. Yet she was not going to take his head off. Instead, she was going to increase his allowance because, apparently, she approved of him. "So I want to tell you," she went on, "though you have not seen fit to tell me anything, that I'm willing you should marry Elizabeth, as soon as you can support her. And you can do that as soon as you graduate, because, as I say, when you are in the works, I shall pay you." Her iron face lighted. "I shall pay you a salary. A good salary. More money." Blair laughed with satisfaction. The prospect soothed the sting of Elizabeth's meanness, which was what he called it, when he did not remember to name it, darkly, faithlessness. He was so comforted that he had, for the first time in his life, an impulse to confide in his mother. "Elizabeth got provoked at me." There was a boyish demand for sympathy in his tone, But Mrs. Maitland interrupted him. "Come along," she said, chuckling. She got up, pulled her bonnet straight, and gave her son a jocose thrust in the ribs that made him jump. "I can't waste time over lovers' quarrels. Patch it up. Patch it up. You can afford to, you know, before you get married. You'll get your innings later, my boy." Still chuckling at her own joke, she slammed down the top of her desk and tramped into the outer office. Blair turned scarlet with anger. The personal familiarity extinguished his little friendly impulse to blurt out his trouble with Elizabeth, as completely as a gust of wind puts out a scarcely lighted candle. He got up, his teeth set, his hands clenched in his pockets, and followed his mother through the yard's vast, hideous wastes, scorching in the September heats, full of endless rows of pig, piles of scrap, acres, it seemed to Blair, of slag. The screeching clamor of the place reeked with the smell of rust and rubbish and sour earth, and the air was vibrant with the clatter of the buggies on the narrow gauge tracks that ran in a tangled network from one furnace to another. Blair, trudging along behind his mother, cringing at the ugliness of everything about him, did not dare to speak. He still felt that dig in the ribs, and was so angry he could not have controlled his voice. Mrs. Maitland walked through her ironworks as some women walk through a garden, lovingly. She talked to her son rapidly. This was so and so. There was such and such a department, in that new shed she meant to put the draftsman. Over there the timekeeper. She paused. Blair had left her, and was standing in an open doorway of the foundry, watching, breathlessly, a jib crane bearing a great ladle full of tons of liquid metal that shimmered above its white-hot expanse with the shifting blue flames of escaping gas. Seething and bubbling, the molten iron slopped in a flashing film over the side of the cauldron, every drop, as it struck the black earth, rebounding in 1,000 exploding points of fire. Above the swaying ladle, far up in the glooms under the roof, the shadows were pierced by the lurching dazzle of arc lamps, but when the ladle tipped, and with a crackling roar the stream of metal flowed into a mold, the sizzling violet gleam of the lamps was abruptly extinguished by the intolerable glare of light. "Oh," Blair said breathlessly, "how wonderful." "It is wonderful," his mother said. "Thomas, here, can move the lever that tips the ladle with his 2 fingers, and out comes the iron as neatly as cream out of a jug." Blair was so entirely absorbed in the fierce magnificence of light, and in the glowing torsos of the molders, planted as they were against the profound shadows of the foundry, that when she said, "Come on," he did not hear her. Mrs. Maitland, standing with her hands on her hips, her feet well apart, held her head high. She was intensely gratified by his interest. If his father had only lived to see him, she said to herself. In her pride, she almost swaggered. She nodded, chuckling, to the molder at her elbow. "He takes to it like a duck to water, doesn't he, Jim?" "And," said Jim, telling the story afterward, "I allowed I'd never seen a young feller as knowing about castings as him." She took it down straight. "You can't pile it on too thick for a woman, about her young un." "Somebody ought to paint it," Blair said, under his breath. Mrs. Maitland's face glowed. She came and stood beside him a moment in silence, resting her big, dirty hand on his shoulder. Then she said, Half sheepishly, I call that ladle the cradle of civilization. Think what's inside of it. There are rails that will hold New York and San Francisco together, and engines and machines for the whole world. There are telegraph wires that will bring, think of all the kinds of news they will bring, Blair, wars, and births of babies. There are bridges in it, and pens that may write, well, maybe love letters, she said, with sly and clumsy humor, or even write, perhaps, the liberty of a race, as Lincoln's pen wrote it. Yes, she said, her face full of luminous abstraction, the cradle of civilization. He could hardly hear her voice in the giant tumult of exploding metal and the hammering and crashing in the adjacent mill, but when she said that, he looked round at her with the astonishment of one who sees a familiar face where he has supposed he would see a stranger. He forgot his shame in having a mother who ran an iron mill. He even forgot that impudent thrust in the ribs. A spark of sympathy leaped between them, as real in its invisibility as the white glitter of the molten iron sputtering over their heads. Yes, he said, it's all that, and it is magnificent, too. Come on, she said, with a proud look. Over her shoulder she flung back at him figures and statistics. She told him of the tons of bridge materials on the books. The rail contract she had just taken was a big thing, very big. We've never handled such an order, but we can do it. They were walking rapidly from the foundry to the furnaces. Sarah Maitland was inspecting piles of pig, talking to puddlers, all the while bending and twisting between her strong fingers, with their blackened nails, a curl of borings, perhaps biting on it, thoughtfully, while she considered some piece of work, then blowing the crumbs of iron out from between her lips and bursting into quick directions or fault-finding. She stood among her men, in her short skirt, her grey hair straggling out over her forehead from under her shabby bonnet, and gave her orders, but for the first time in her life she was self-conscious. Blair was looking on. Listening. Thinking, no doubt, that one of these days he would be doing just what she was doing. For the moment she was as vain as a girl. Then, abruptly, her happy excitement paused. She stood still, flinching and wincing, and putting a hand up to her eye. H, she said, a filing. She looked with the other sympathetically watering eye at her son. Here, take this thing out. Blair said, dismayed. Oh, I might hurt you. Then, in his helplessness and concern, for, ignorant as he was, he knew enough of the works to know that an iron filing in your eye is no joke, he turned, with a flurried gesture, to one of the molders. Get a doctor, can't you? Don't stand there staring. Doctor, said Mrs. Maitland. She gave her son a look, and laughed. He's afraid he'll hurt me, she said, with a warm joyousness in her voice. Jim, got a jackknife? Just dig this thing out. Jim came, dirty and hesitating, but prepared for a very common emergency of the works. With a black thumb and forefinger he raised the wincing blade, and with the pointed blade of the jackknife lifted, with delicacy and precision, the irritating iron speck from the eyeball. Obliged, Mrs. Maitland said. She clapped a rather grimy handkerchief over the poor red eye, and turned to Blair. Come on, she said, and struck him on the shoulder so heartily that he stumbled. Her cheek was blackened by the molder's greasy fingers, and so smeared with tears from the still watering eye that he could not bear to look at it. He hesitated, then offered her his handkerchief, which at least had the advantage of being clean. She took it, glanced at its elaborate monogram, and laughed, then she dabbed her eye with it. I guess I'll have to put some of that cologne of yours on this fancy thing. Remember that green bottle with the calendar and the red ribbons on it, that you gave me when you were a little fellow? I've never had anything of my own fine enough to use the stuff on. When they got back to the office again she was very brief and businesslike with him. She had had a fine morning, but she couldn't waste any more time. You can keep all this that you have seen in your mind. I don't know just where I shall put you. If you have a preference, express it. Then she told him what his salary would be when he got to work, and what allowance he was to have for the present. Now, clear out, she said, goodbye, and turned her cheek toward him for their semi-annual parting. Blair, with his eyes shut, kissed her. Goodbye, mother. It has been awfully interesting. And I am awfully obliged to you about the allowance. On the threshold of the office he halted. Mother, he said, and his voice was generous even to wistfulness. Mother, that cradle thing was stunning. Mrs. Maitland nodded proudly. When he had gone, she folded his handkerchief up, and with a queer, shy gesture, slipped it into the bosom of her dress. Then she rang her bell. Ask Mr. Ferguson to step here. When her superintendent took the chair beside her desk, she was all business, but when business was over and he got up, she stopped him. Tell the bookkeeper to double Blair's allowance, beginning today. Ferguson made a memorandum. And Mr. Ferguson, I have told Blair that I consent to his engagement with Elizabeth, and I shall make it possible for them to be married as soon as he graduates. But I do this, she went on, her satisfaction warm in her voice, because I think he needs the incentive that comes to a young man when he wants to get married. It is natural and proper. And I will see that things are right for them. In the first place, said Robert Ferguson, I would not permit Elizabeth to marry Blair, but fortunately we need not discuss that. They have quarreled, and there is no longer any question of such a thing. Quarreled, but only this morning, not an hour ago, he let me suppose. She paused. Well, I am sorry. She paused again, and made aimless marks with her pen on the blotter. That's all this morning, Mr. Ferguson. And though he lingered to tell her, with grim amusement, of Elizabeth's angry bath, she made no further comment. When he had left the office, she got up and shut the door. Then she went back to her chair, and leaning an elbow on her desk, covered her lips with her hand. After she had sat thus for nearly 10 minutes, she suddenly rang for an office boy. Take this handkerchief up to the house to my son, she said. He forgot it. Chapter 9. For the next 5 or 6 years Blair was not often at home. At the end of his freshman year he was conditioned, and found a tutor in the seashore and his sketching, for he painted with some enthusiasm just at that time, much more attractive than his mother and Mercer. After that he went to Europe in the long vacations. How much vacation have I had since I began to run his business for him? His mother said once in answer to Nanny's intercession that he might be allowed to travel. But she let him go. She did not know how to do anything else. She always let him do what he pleased, and have what he wanted. She gave him everything, and she exacted no equivalent, either in scholarship or conduct. It never occurred to her to make him appreciate his privileges by paying for them, and so, of course, she pauperized him. Blair likes Europe, she said one Sunday afternoon to David Ritchie, who had come in to see Nanny, but as for me, I wouldn't take an hour of my good time, or spend $1 of my good money, to see the best of their cathedrals and statues and things. Do you mean to say there is a cathedral in the world as handsome as my new foundry? Well, David said modestly, I haven't seen any cathedrals, you know. Mrs. Maitland. It's small loss to you, David, she said kindly. But I wish I'd thought to invite you to go along with Blair last summer. You might have liked it, though you are a pretty sensible fellow in most things. Oh, I can't go to Europe till I can earn enough to pay my own way, David replied, and added with a quick look at Nanny, besides, I like being in Mercer. Blair has no need to earn money, said Mrs. Maitland carelessly, then she blew out her lips in a bubbling sigh. And he would rather see a cathedral than his mother. The pathos of that pricked even the pleasant egotism of youth. David winced, and Nanny tried to murmur something of her brother's needing the rest. Mrs. Maitland gave her grunt of amusement. Rest? What's he ever done to tire him? Well, clear out, you two, if you're going to take a walk. I'm glad you came back for your vacation, David, at any rate. Nanny needs shaking up. She sticks at home here with me, and a girl ought to see people once in a while. She glanced at the two young creatures shrewdly. Why not? She reflected. She had never thought of it before, but why not? It would be a very sensible arrangement. The next moment she had decided that it should be. Nanny's money would be a help to the boy, and he needn't depend on his doctoring business. I must put it through, she said to herself, just as she might have said that she should put through a piece of work in the office. This matchmaking purpose made her invite David to supper very frequently, and every time he came she was apt, after he had taken his departure, to tramp into Nanny's parlor in the hope of being told that the sensible arrangement had been made. When she found them together, and caught a word or two about Elizabeth, she had no flash of insight. But, except to her, the situation as regarded David and Elizabeth was perfectly clear. When, 7 years before, the two boys had gone off together to college, Blair had confided to his friend that his faith in women was forever destroyed. Though I shall love Elizabeth, always, he said. Maybe she'll come round? David tried to comfort him. If she doesn't, I shall never love another woman, Blair said darkly. David was silent, but as he and Blair were just then in the Damon and Pythias stage, and had sworn to each other that no woman should ever come between them, he gave a hopeless shrug. That dishes me, he said to himself. So long as he will never love any other girl, I can't cut in. It would have been rather a relief to Mrs. Ritchie to know that her son had reached this artless conclusion, for the last thing she desired was that David's calf love should harden into any real purpose. Elizabeth, sweet-hearted below the careless selfishness of a temper which it never occurred to her must be controlled, was a most kissable young creature to her elders, and Mrs. Ritchie was heartily fond of her. But all the same she did not want a daughter-in-law with a temper. Elizabeth, on her part, repelled by David's mother's unattainable perfections, never allowed the older woman to feel intimate with her. That first meeting so many years ago, when they had each recoiled from the other, seemed to have left a gulf between them, which had never quite closed up. So Mrs. Ritchie was just as well pleased that in the next few years David, for one reason or another, did not see his old neighbor very often. By the time he was 24, and well along in his course at the medical school, she had almost forgotten her vague apprehensions. The pause in the intimacy of the mother and son, the inevitable pause that comes between the boy's 17th and 20th years, had ended, and David and his mother were frank and confidential friends again. Yet, though she did not know it, one door was still closed between them. He's forgotten all about it, Mrs. Ritchie told herself comfortably, and never guessed that in silence he remembered. Of course David's boyish idea of honor was no longer subject to the claim of friendship, for Blair had entirely recovered from his first passion. The only thing he feared now was his own unworth. After all, what had a dumb fellow like himself to offer such a radiant being? For indeed she was radiant. The girl he had known nearly all his life, impetuous, devoid of self-consciousness, giving her sweet, sexless love with both generous hands, had vanished with the old frank days of dropping an uninvited head on a boy's shoulder. Now, though she was still impetuous, still unconscious of self, she was glowing with womanhood, and ready to be loved. She was not beautiful, except in so far as she was young, for youth is always beautiful. She was tall, of a sweet and delicate thinness, and with the faint coloring of a blush rose. Her dimple was exquisite. Her brows were straight and fine, shading eyes wonderfully star-like, but often stormy, eyes of clear, dark amber, which, now that David had come home, were full of dreams. Before her joyous personality, no wonder poor inarticulate David was torn with apprehensions. He did not share them with his mother, who, with more or less misgiving, began to guess how things were for herself. He knew instinctively that Mrs. Ritchie's gentle, orderly mind could not possibly understand Elizabeth, still less appreciate the peculiar charm to his inherent reasonableness of her sweet, stormy, undisciplined temperament. Nanny Maitland could not understand either, and yet it was to Nanny, kind, literal little Nanny, who never understood anything abstract, that David revealed his heart. She was intensely sympathetic, and having long ago relinquished the sister-in-law dream, encouraged him to rave about Elizabeth to his heart's content. In fact, for at least a year before Mrs. Maitland had evolved that sensible arrangement for her stepdaughter, David, whenever he was at home, used to go to see Nanny simply to pour out his hopes or his dismays. It was mostly dismays, for it seemed to him that Elizabeth was as uncertain as the wind. She doesn't, he used to say to himself. And then he would question Nanny, who, having received certain confidences from the other side, would reassure him so warmly that he would take heart again. At the time that he finally dared to put his fate to the touch, Mrs. Maitland's matchmaking intentions for Nanny had reached a point where she had made up her mind to put the matter through without any more delay. "I'll speak to Mrs. Ritchie about it, and get the thing settled," she said to herself. No use dawdling along this way. But just the day before she found time to speak to Mrs. Ritchie, it was in David's midwinter recess, something happened. Elizabeth had accepted, not too eagerly, of course, an invitation to walk with him, and off they went, down Sandusky Street to the river and across the old covered bridge. They stopped to say how do you do to Mrs. Todd, who was peering out from behind the scarlet geraniums in the window of the saloon. Elizabeth took the usual suggestive joke about a pretty pair with a little otter, but David beamed, and as he left the room he squeezed Mrs. Todd suddenly round her fat waist, which made her squeak but pleased her very much. "Made for each other," she whispered wheezily, and David slipped a bill into her hand through sheer joy. Better have some ice cream, the old lady wheedled, such hot blood needs cooling. Oh, Mrs. Todd, she is so cool, I don't need ice cream, the young fellow mourned in her motherly ear. Get out with ye, ain't you got eyes? She's waitin' to eat you up, and starvin' for ye. And David hurried after Elizabeth, who had reached the toll gate and was waiting, if not to eat him, at any rate for his company. She's a dear old soul, he said joyfully. I believe you gave her a kiss, Elizabeth declared. I gave her a hug. She said things I liked. Elizabeth, guessing what the things might have been, swerved away from the subject, and murmured how pretty the country looked. There had been a snowstorm the night before, and the fields were glistening, unbroken sheets of white. The road David chose was followed by a brook that ran chuckling between the agate strips of ice along its banks. Here and there a dipping branch had been caught and was held in a tinkling crystal prison, and here and there the ice conquered the current, and the water could be heard gurgling and complaining under its snowy covering. David thought that all the world was beautiful, now that Mrs. Todd had bidden him use his eyes. Remember when we used to sled down this hill, Elizabeth? She turned her cool, glowing face toward him and nodded. Indeed I do. And you used to haul my sled up to the top again. I don't think I have forgotten anything we did. Instantly she veered away from personalities. Isn't it a pity Blair dislikes Mercer so much? Nanny is dreadfully lonely without him. She has you. I don't see how she can be lonely. Oh, I don't count for anything compared to Blair. Her breath carried quickly. The starry light was in her eyes, but he did not see it. He was not daring to look at her. You count for everything to me, he said, in a constrained voice. She was silent. Elizabeth, do you think you could care? A little? She looked away from him without a word. David trembled. It's all up, he said to himself. And even as he said it, a small, cold hand was stretched out to him, a hand that trembled. David, I am not good enough. Truly, I am not. The very shock of having his doubts and fears crumble so suddenly made him stand stock still. He turned very white. What? He said, in a low voice, you care? Oh no, you don't? You can't. I can't believe it. Upon which Elizabeth was instantly joyous again. Well, I won't, if you don't want me to, she said gaily, and walked on, leaving him standing, amazed, in the snow. Then she looked back at him over her shoulder. At that arch and lovely look he bounded to her, stammering something, he did not know what himself, but she laughed, glowing and scolding, swerving over to the other side of the path. David, we are on a public road. Stop, please. To think of your caring, he said, almost in a whisper. His face, with its flash of ecstasy, was like wine to her. All her soul spoke fearlessly in her eyes. Care? Why, David, I was only so awfully afraid you weren't going to ask me. His lip trembled. He was quite speechless. But Elizabeth was bubbling over with joy. Then suddenly, her exhilaration flagged. What will your mother say? She doesn't like me. Elizabeth, she loves you. How could she help it? How could anybody help it? It's my temper, she said, sighing, my wicked temper. Of course I never mean anything I say, and I can't imagine why people mind, but they do. Last week I made Cherry Pie cry. Of course she oughtn't to have been hurt, she knows me. You see I am really a devil, David, to make dear, old Cherry Pie unhappy. But I don't believe I will ever lose my temper again as long as I live. I am going to be good, like your mother. The tears stood in her eyes. Mrs. Ritchie is so simply perfect I am sort of afraid of her. I wish she had ever been wicked, like me. David, what shall we do if she won't consent? She'll consent all right, he said, chuckling, and added with the sweet and trusting egotism of youth. The only thing in the world Materna wants, you know, is my happiness. But do you suppose it would make any difference if she didn't consent? You are for me, he said with an abrupt solemnity that was almost harsh. Nothing in the world can take you from me. And she whispered, nothing. Then David, like every lover who has ever loved, cast his challenge into the grinning face of fate. This is forever, Elizabeth. Forever, David. On their way home, as they passed the toll house, he left her and ran up the path to tap on the window. When Mrs. Todd beamed at him through the geraniums, I've got her. He cried. And the gay old voice called back, Glory be. On the bridge in the gathering dusk they stood for some time without speaking, looking down at the river. Once or twice a passer-by glanced at the two figures leaning there on the handrail, and wondered at the foolishness of people who would stand in the cold and look at a river full of ice, but David and Elizabeth did not see the passing world. The hurrying water ran in a turbulent, foam-streaked flood. Great sheets of ice, rocking and grinding against one another, made a continuous soft crash of sound. Sometimes one of them would strike the wooden casing of a pier, and then the whole bridge jarred and quivered, and the cake of ice, breaking and splintering, would heap itself on a long white speed that pushed upstream through the rushing current. The river was yellow with mud torn up by a freshet back among the hills, but the last rays of the sun, a disk of copper sinking into the brown haze behind the hills, caught on the broken edges of the icy snow, and made a sudden white glitter almost from shore to shore. "Elizabeth," David said, "I want to tell you something." I stood right here, and looked at a raft coming down the river, the evening that Blair told me that you and he. "Don't," she said, shivering. "I won't," he told her tenderly. "You were only a child, it didn't mean anything. Don't you suppose I understand? But I wanted you to know that it was then, nearly 8 years ago, when I was just a boy, that I realized that He paused. She looked at him silently, her lip quivered and she nodded. "And I have never changed since," he said. "I stood just here, leaning on this railing, and I was so wretched." He laughed under his breath. "I didn't know what was the matter with me. I was only a cub, you know. But," he spoke very softly, "all of a sudden I knew. Elizabeth," a woman on the raft looked up at me. "There was a little baby. Dear, it was then that I knew I loved you." At those elemental words her heart came up into her throat. She could not speak, but suddenly she stooped and kissed the battered handrail where he said his hands had rested. David, horrified, glancing right and left in the dusk and seeing no one, put a swift arm about her in which to whisper a single word. Then, very softly, he kissed her cheek. For a moment she seemed to ebb away from him. Then, abruptly, like the soft surge of a returning wave, she sank against his breast and her lips demanded his. That night David told his mother. He had been profoundly shaken by Elizabeth's lovely unexpected motion there in the twilight on the bridge. It was a motion so divinely unconscious of the outside world, that he was moved to the point of finding no words to say how moved he was. But she had felt him tremble from head to foot when her lips burned against his, so she needed no words. His silence still lasted when, after an hour next door with her, he came home and sat down on the sofa beside his mother. He nuzzled his blonde head against hers for a moment, then slipped an arm round her waist. "It's all right, Materna," he said, with a sort of gasp. "What is, dear?" "Oh, mother, the idea of asking. The only thing in the world." "You mean, you and Elizabeth?" "Yes," he said. She was silent for a moment. When she spoke her voice broke a little. "When was it, dear?" "This afternoon," he said. And once started, he overflowed. "I can't get my breath yet, though I've known it since 4:15." Mrs. Ritchie laughed, and then sighed. "David, of course I'm happy, if you are, but I hope she's good enough for you, dear." She felt him stiffen against her shoulder. "Good enough? For me, Materna, she is perfect. Don't you suppose I know? I've known her nearly all my life, and I can say she is perfect." "She is as perfect as you are. She said you were perfect this afternoon." "Yes, I never supposed I could say that any woman was as good, and lovely, and pure, as you." "David, please don't say such things." David was not listening. "But I can say it of Elizabeth. Oh, what a lucky fellow I am. I always thought Blair would get her. He's such a mighty good fellow, and so darn good looking, confound him." David ruminated affectionately. "And he can talk, he's not bottled up, like me. To think she would look at me, when she could have had him, or anybody else. It seems kind of mean to cut Blair out, when he isn't here. He hasn't seen her, you know, for about 2 years. Perhaps you would like to call it off until he gets home, and give him a chance?" David grinned. "No, thank you. Oh, Materna, she is, you know, really, so sort of wonderful. Sometime I want to talk to you about her. I don't believe anybody quite understands Elizabeth but me. But to think of her caring for me. To think of my having 2 such women to care for me." He took her hand gently and kissed it. "Mother," he said, he spoke with almost painful effort. "Mother, I want to tell you something. I want to tell you, because Being what you are, you can't in the least understand what it means. But I do want you to know, I've never kissed any woman but you, Materna, until I kissed her. Oh, said Helena Richie, in a stifled voice, don't, David, don't, I can't bear it. And if she doesn't make you happy? Make me happy? David said. He paused, that unasked kiss burned once more against his lips, he almost shivered at the pang of it. Materna, he said hoarsely, if she or I were to die tonight, I, at any rate, have had happiness enough in these few hours to have made it worthwhile to have lived. Love doesn't mean just happiness, she said. David was silent for a moment, then he said, very gently, you are thinking of your little boy, who died? Yes, and of my marriage, it was not happy, David. He pressed his cheek against hers, without speaking. The grief of an unhappy marriage he had long ago guessed, and in this moment of his own happiness the remembrance of it was intolerable to him. As for the other grief, when I think of the baby, he said, softly, I feel as if that little beggar gave me my mother. I feel as if I had his job, and if I am not a good son, he stopped, and looked at her, smiling, but something in her face, perhaps the pitiful effort to smile back through the tears of an old sorrow, gave him a sudden, solemn thrill. The race pain stirred in him. He seemed to see his own child, dead, in Elizabeth's arms. Mother, he said, thickly, and caught her in his arms. She felt his heart pounding heavily in his side, but she smiled. Yes, she said, my little boy gave me another son, though I didn't deserve him. No, I didn't, she insisted, laying her soft mother hand over his protesting lips. I used to wonder sometimes, David, why God trusted you to me, instead of to a better woman. Again she checked his outburst that God had never made a better woman. Hush, dear, hush. But I didn't mean that love might mean sorrow. There are worse things in the world than sorrow, she ended, almost in a whisper. Yes, there are worse things, he said quietly, of course I know that. But they are not possible things where Elizabeth is concerned. There is only one thing that can hurt us, death. Oh, my dear, life can hurt so much more than death. So much more. But David had nothing more to say of life and love. He retreated abruptly to the matter of fact. He had gone to his limit, not only of expression, but of that modesty of soul which forbids exposure of the emotions, and is as exquisite in a young man as physical modesty is in a girl. He was unwilling, indeed he was unable, to show even to his mother, even, perhaps, to Elizabeth, the speechless depths that had been stirred that afternoon by the first kiss of passion, and stirred again that night by the sight of tears for a baby dead for almost a quarter of a century. He got up, thrust his hands into his pockets, and whistled. Heaven knows how long it will be before we can be married. How soon do you think I can count on getting patience enough to get married? Mrs. Ritchie laughed, though there was still a break of pain in her voice. My dear boy, when you leave the medical school I mean to give you an allowance which... No, maternal, he interrupted her. I am going to stand on my own legs. David's feeling about self-support gave him a satisfaction out of all proportion to the pain it sometimes gave his mother. She winced now, as if his words hurt her. David, all that I have is yours. No, he said again. I couldn't accept anything. I believe if a man can't take care of his wife himself, he has no business to have a wife. It's bad enough for you to be supporting a big, hungry medical student, but I swear you shan't feed his wife, too. I can't be indebted, even to you. He ended, with the laughing cocksureness of high-minded youth. Indebted? Oh, David, she said. For a moment his words wounded her, but when he had left her to go back to Elizabeth again, and she sat alone by her fireside, she forgot this surface wound in some deeper pain. David had said he had never kissed any woman but her, until he kissed her. He had said that the things that were worse than death were not possible to Elizabeth. For a moment this soft mother felt a stab of something like jealousy, then her thought went back to that deeper pain. He had not supposed anybody could be as perfect as his mother. Helena Ritchie cowered, as if the sacred words were whips. She covered her face with her hands, and sat a long time without moving. Perhaps she was thinking of a certain old letter, locked away in her desk, and in her heart, for she knew every word of it. My child, your secret belongs to your heavenly Father. It is never to be taken from his hands, except for one reason, to save some other child of his. Never for any smaller reason of peace of mind to yourself. When she lifted her bowed head from her hands, the fire was out. There were tears upon her face. Chapter 10. It was the very next afternoon that Mrs. Maitland found time to look after Nanny's matrimonial interests. In the raw December twilight, she tramped muddily into Mrs. Ritchie's firelit parlor, which was fragrant with hyacinths blossoming on every windowsill. Mr. Ferguson had started them in August in his own cellar, for, as any landlord will tell you, it is the merest matter of business to do all you can for a good tenant. Mrs. Maitland found her superintendent and Mrs. Ritchie just shaking hands on David's luck, Mrs. Ritchie a little tremulous, and Robert Ferguson a little grudging, of course. "Well, I hope they'll be happy," he said, sighing. "I suppose some marriages are happy, but—" "Oh, Mr. Ferguson, you are delightful," Mrs. Ritchie said, and it was at that moment that Mrs. Maitland came tramping in. Instantly the large, vital presence made the charming room seem small and crowded. There were too many flowers, too many ornaments, too many photographs of David. Mrs. Maitland sat down heavily on a gilded chair that creaked so ominously that she rose and looked at it impatiently. "Foolish sort of furniture," she said. "Give me something solid, please, to sit on." "Well, Mrs. Ritchie, how do you do? Nanny has told you our great news?" Mrs. Ritchie inquired. "Oh, so it's come to a head, has it?" Mrs. Maitland said, vastly pleased. "Of course I knew what was in the wind, but I didn't know it was settled. Fact is, I haven't seen her, except at breakfast, and then I was in too much of a hurry to think of it." Well, nothing could be better. That's what I came to see you about. I wanted to hurry things along. What do you say to it, Mr. Ferguson?" Mrs. Maitland looked positively benign. She was sitting, a little gingerly, on the edge of the yellow damask sofa at one side of the fireplace, her feet wide apart, her skirt pulled back over her knees, so that her scorching petticoat was somewhat liberally displayed. Her big shoes began to steam in the comfortable heat of a soft coal fire that was blazing and snapping between the brass jambs. Mrs. Ritchie had drawn up a chair beside her, and Robert Ferguson stood with his elbow on the mantelpiece looking down at them. Even to Mr. Ferguson, Mrs. Maitland's presence in the gently feminine room was incongruous. There was a little table at the side of the sofa, and Mrs. Maitland, thrusting out a large, gesticulating hand, swept a silver picture frame to the floor. In the confusion of picking it up and putting it into a safer place, the little emotional tension of the moment vanished. Mrs. Ritchie winked away a tear, and laughed, and said it was too absurd to think that their children were men and women, with their own lives and interests and hopes, and love affairs. "But love-making is in the air, apparently," she said. "Young Knight is going to be married." "What, Goose Molly's stepson?" Mrs. Maitland said. "She used to make sheep's eyes at somebody I knew. But she didn't get him. Well, I must give the boy a present. And the next thing," Mrs. Ritchie went on, "will be Nanny's engagement. Only it will be hard to find anybody good enough for Nanny." "Nanny," said Mrs. Maitland blankly. "She is to be Elizabeth's bridesmaid, of course, unless she gets married before our wedding comes off. A young doctor has to have patience before he can have a wife, so I'm afraid the chances are Elizabeth will be Nanny's bridesmaid." She was so full of these maternal and womanly visions that the sudden slight rigidity of Mrs. Maitland's face did not strike her. "Nanny has been so interested," Mrs. Ritchie went on. "David will always be grateful to her for helping his cause. I don't know what he would have done without Nanny to confide in." Mrs. Maitland's face relaxed. So Nanny had not been slighted? She herself, Nanny's mother, had made a mistake, that was all. Well, she was sorry. She wished it had been Nanny. Poor thing, it was lonely for her, in that big, empty house. But these two people, patting themselves on the back with their personal satisfaction about their children, they must not guess her wish. There was no resentment in her mind, it was one of the chances of business. David had chosen Elizabeth, more fool David. For Nanny'll have. Mrs. Maitland made some rapid calculations, but it's not my kettle of fish, she reflected, and hoisted herself up from the low, deeply cushioned sofa. "I hope Elizabeth will put her mind on housekeeping," she said. "A young doctor has to get all the pork he can for his shilling. He needs a saving wife." "She'll have to be a saving wife, I'm afraid," Mrs. Ritchie said, with rueful pride, "for that foolish boy of mine declines, if you please, to be helped out by an allowance from me." Oh, he'll have more sense when he's more in love, Mrs. Maitland assured her easily. I never knew a man yet who would refuse honest money when it was offered to him. Well, Mrs. Ritchie, with all this marrying going on, I suppose the next thing will be you and friend Ferguson. Even as she said it, she saw in a flash an inevitable meaning in the words, and she gave a great guffaw of laughter. Bless you. I didn't mean that. I meant you'd be picking up a wife somewhere, Mr. Ferguson, and Mrs. Ritchie, here, would be finding a husband. But the other way would be easier, and a very sensible arrangement. The two victims of her peculiar sense of humor held themselves as well as they could. Mrs. Ritchie reddened slightly, but looked blank. Robert Ferguson's jaw actually dropped, but he was able to say casually that of course it would be some time before the young people could be married. Well, give my love to Elizabeth, Mrs. Maitland said. Tell her not to jump into the river if she gets angry with David. Do you remember how she did that in one of her furies at Blair, Mr. Ferguson? She gave a grunt of a laugh and took herself off, pausing at the front door to call back, Don't forget my good advice, you people. Robert Ferguson, putting on his hat with all possible expedition, got out of the house almost as quickly as she did. I'd like to choke her, he said to himself. He felt the desire to choke Mrs. Maitland several times that evening as he sat in his library pretending to read his newspaper. She ought to be ashamed of herself. Mrs. Ritchie will think I have been, heaven knows what she will think. But the truth was, Mrs. Ritchie thought nothing at all. She forgot the incident entirely. It was Robert Ferguson who did the embarrassed thinking. As for Mrs. Maitland, she went home through Mercer's mire and fog, her iron face softening into almost feminine concern. She was saying to herself that if Nanny didn't care, why, she didn't care. But if she hankers after him, Mrs. Maitland's face twinged with annoyance. If she hankers after him, I'll make it up to her in some way. I'll give her a good big check. But she must make sure about the hankering. It would not be difficult to make sure. In these silent years together, the strong nature had drawn the weak nature to it, as a magnet draws a speck of iron. Nanny, timid to the point of awe, never daring even in her thoughts to criticize the powerful personality that dominated her daily life, nestled against it, so to speak, with perfect content. Sarah Maitland's aesthetic deficiencies, which separated her so tragically from her son, did not alienate Nanny. The fact that her stepmother was rich, and yet lived in a poverty-stricken locality, that the inconvenience of the old house amounted to squalor, that they were almost completely isolated from people of their own class, none of these things disturbed Nanny. They were merely Mama's ways, that was all there was to say about them. She was not confidential with Mrs. Maitland, because she had nothing to confide. But if her stepmother had ever asked any personal question, she would have been incapable of not replying. Mrs. Maitland knew that, and proposed to satisfy herself as to the hankering. Supper was on the table when she got home, and though while bolting her food she glanced at Nanny rather keenly, she did not try to probe her feelings. But she looks down in the mouth, Sarah Maitland thought. There must have been delicacy somewhere in the big nature, for she was careful not to speak of Elizabeth's engagement before Harris, for fear the girl might, by some involuntary tremor of lip or eyelid, betray herself. I'll look in on you after supper, she said. Nanny, with a start, said, Oh, thank you, Mama. When Mrs. Maitland, with her knitting and a fistful of unopened letters, came over to the parlor, she had also tucked into her belt a check. It had never occurred to Nanny, in all these years and with a very liberal allowance, to mitigate her parlor. It was still a place of mirrors, grown perhaps a little dim, of chandeliers in balloons of brown paper muslin, which, to be sure, had split here and there with age, so that a glimmer of cut glass sparkled dimly through the cracks, a place of marble-topped tables, and crimson brocade curtains dingy with age and soot, a place where still the only human thing was Nanny's drawing board. She was bending over it now, copying with a faithful pencil a little picture of a man and a maid, and a dove and a love. She was going to give the drawing to Elizabeth. In fact, she had begun it several days ago with joyous anticipation of this happy happening. But now, as she worked, her hand trembled. She had had a letter from Blair, and all her joyousness had fled. The Dean is an ass, of course, but Mother'll get excited about it, I'm afraid. Do smooth her down, if you can. No wonder Nanny's hand trembled. Mrs. Maitland, putting her letters on the table, sat down heavily and began to knit. She glanced at Nanny over her spectacles. "Better get through with it," she said to herself. Then, aloud, "Well, Nanny, so David and Elizabeth have made a match of it?" For a minute Nanny's face brightened. "Yes. Isn't it fine? I'm so pleased. David has been crazy about her ever since he was a boy." Well, she was heart whole. There was no doubt of that. Mrs. Maitland, visibly relieved, dismissed from her mind the whole foolish business of love-making. She began to read her letters, Nanny watching her furtively. When the third letter was taken up, a letter with the seal of the university in the upper left-hand corner of the envelope, Blair's sister breathed quickly. Mrs. Maitland, ripping the envelope open with a thrust of her forefinger, read it swiftly, then again, slowly. Then she said something under her breath and struck her fist on the table. Nanny's fingers whitened on her pencil. Sarah Maitland got up and stood on the hearthrug, her back to the fire. "I'll have to go east," she said, and began to bite her forefinger. "Oh, Mama," Nanny broke out, "I am sure there isn't anything really wrong. Perhaps he has been a little foolish. Men are foolish in college. David got into hot water lots of times. But Blair hasn't done anything really bad, and..." Mrs. Maitland gave her a somber look. "He wrote to you, did he?" she said, and Nanny realized that she had not advanced her brother's cause. Mrs. Maitland picked up her letters and began to sort them out. "When is he going to grow up?" she said. "He's 24, and he's been dawdling round at college for the last 2 years. He's not bad. He hasn't stuff enough in him to be bad. He is just lazy and useless, and he's had every chance young man could have." "Mama," Nanny protested, "it isn't fair to speak that way of Blair, and it isn't true, not a word of it. Nanny, the afraid cat of 20 years ago, afraid still of thunderstorms in the dark, and Sarah Maitland, and what not, Nanny, when it came to defending Blair, had all the audacious courage of love. He is not lazy, he is not useless. He is, Nanny stammered with angry distress. He is dear, and good, and kind, and never did any harm in his life. Never. It's perfectly dreadful, Mama, for you to say such things about him." Well, said Sarah Maitland, lifting an amused eyebrow. It was as if a hummingbird had attacked a steel billet. Her face softened into pleased affection. "Well, stick up for him," she said. "I like it in you, my dear, though what you say is foolish enough. You remind me of your mother. But your brother has brains. Yes, I'll say that for him, he's like me, he has brains. That's why I'm so out of patience with him," she ended, lapsing into moody displeasure again. "If he was a fool, I wouldn't mind his behaving like a fool. But he has brains." Then she said, briefly, "Night," and tramped off to the dining room. The next morning when Nanny, a little pale from a worried night, came down to breakfast, her stepmother's place was empty. "Yes," Harris explained, "she went off at 12, Miss Nanny. She didn't let on where. She said you'd know." "I know," poor Nanny said, and turned paler than ever. Chapter 11. After Mrs. Maitland had had an interview with the dean, she went off across the yard, under the great elms dripping in the rainy January thaw. Following his directions, she found her way through the corridors of a new building whose inappropriate expensiveness was obvious at every turn. Blair had rooms there, as had most of the sons of rich fathers. The whole place smelt of money. In Blair's apartment money was less obvious than beauty, but it was expensive beauty. He had a few good pictures, and on one wall a wonderful tapestry of forest foliage and roebucks, that he had picked up in Europe at a price which added to the dealer's affection for traveling Americans. The furnishing was in quiet and, for that period, remarkably good taste, masculine enough to balance a certain delicacy of detail, exquisite Tanagra figures, watercolors and pastels of women in costumes of rose and violet gauze, incense smoldering in an ivory jar, and much small bijouterie that meant an almost feminine appreciation of exquisite and costly prettiness. Mrs. Maitland came tramping down the hall, her face set and stern, but suddenly, almost at Blair's door, she paused. Someone was singing. She knew the voice, beautiful, joyous, beating and pulsating with life. "Drink to me only with thine eyes, and I will pledge with mine." She moved over to a window that lit the long corridor, and listened. "Or leave a kiss." Sarah Maitland stared out into the rain, The bare branches of the trees whipped against one another in the wind, but she did not see them. She leaned her forehead on the glass, listening to the golden voice. A warm wave seemed to rise in her breast, a wave of cosmic satisfaction in this vitality that was hers, because he was hers. Her eyes blurred so with emotion that she did not see the rocking branches in the rain. All the hardness of her face melted, under those melting cadences, into exultant maternity. Or leave a kiss but in the cup. And I'll not look for wine. The thirst that from the soul. She smiled, then turned and knocked peremptorily at her son's door. Blair, pausing in his song to comment on a thirst that rises otherwhere than in the soul, roared out a jolly command to come in. But for an instant he did not realize who stood on the threshold, nor was his mother able to distinguish him in the group of men lounging about a room dim with tobacco smoke. He was standing with his back to the door, pulling a somewhat reluctant cork from a bottle of sherry gripped between his knees. Blair was immensely popular at college, not only because of the easy generosities of his wealth, which were often only a pleasant form of selfishness that brought the fellows about him as honey brings flies, but because of a certain sympathetic quality of mind, a genius for companionship that was almost a genius for friendship. Now, his room was full of men. One of his guests was sitting on the windowsill, kicking his heels and swaying rhythmically back and forth to the twang of his banjo. One had begun to read aloud with passionate emphasis a poem, of which happily Mrs. Maitland did not catch the words. All of them were smoking. The door opened, but no one entered. One of the young men, feeling the draught, glanced languidly over his shoulder and got on his feet with extraordinary expedition. He said something under his breath. But it was the abrupt silence of the room that made Blair turn round. It did not need his stammering dismay, his half-cringing, "Clear out, will you fellows," to get the men out of the room. They did not know who she was, but they knew she was somebody. She did not speak, but the powerful personality seemed to sweep in and clear the atmosphere of its sickly triviality. She stood blocking up the doorway, looking at them. They were mostly seniors, but there was not a man among them who did not feel foolish under that large and quiet look. Then she stepped a little aside. The movement was unmistakable. They jostled one another like a flock of sheep in their effort to get away quickly. Somebody muttered, "Good afternoon," but the others were speechless. They left a speechless host behind them. Mrs. Maitland, her rusty bonnet very much on one side, watched them go. Then she closed the door behind them, and stood looking at her son, who was still holding the corkscrew in his hands. Her feet were planted firmly wide apart, her hands were on her hips, her eyebrow was lifting ominously. "Well," she said, with the echo of that golden voice still in her ears. Her own voice was, even to herself, unexpectedly mild. "I didn't expect you," Blair managed to say. "I inferred as much," she said dryly. "So this is the way you keep up with your classes?" "There are no lectures at this time of day," he said. "If you had been so kind, my dear mother, as to let me know you were coming," he spoke with that exaggerated and impertinent politeness that confesses fright, "I would have met you. Instead of that, you burst in." He was getting whiter and whiter. The thought that the men had seen the unkempt figure, the powerful face, the straggling locks of hair, the bare hands, seen, in fact, the unlovely exterior of a large and generous nature, a nature which, alas, he, her son, had never seen, that they had seen her, and guessed, of course, that she was his mother, was positively unendurable to Blair. He tried to speak, but his voice shook into silence. His dismay was not entirely ignoble. The situation was excruciating to a man whose feeling for beauty was a form of religion. His mortification had in it the element of horror for a profaned ideal. His mother was an aesthetic insult to motherhood. "I've no fault to find with your friends being here, if they don't interfere with your studies," Mrs. Maitland said. "Oh," he said rather blankly. Then his shame of her stung him into fury. "Why didn't you tell me that you—" "I've been to see the dean," she said. "Sit down there and listen to me. Here, give me a chair, not that pincushion thing. Give me a chair fit for a man to sit on, if you've got one in this upholstery shop." Blair, with trembling hands, pushed a mahogany chair to her side. He did not sit down himself. He stood with folded arms and downcast eyes. She was not unkind, she was not even ungentle. She was merely explicit. He was a fool. All this business, she pointed to the bottle and the empty glasses, all this business was idiotic, it was a boy's foolishness. It shows how young you are, Blair, she said kindly, though the Lord knows you are old enough in years to have some sense. But if he kept the foolishness up, and this other tomfoolery on account of which she had had to leave the works and spend her valuable time talking to the dean, why, he might be expelled. He would certainly be suspended. And that would put off his getting into business for still another year. And you were 24, she said. While she talked, she looked about her, and the mother softness began to die out of her eyes. Sarah Maitland had never seen her son's room. She saw, now, soft green hangings, great bowls of roses, a sideboard with an array of glasses, a wonderfully carved ivory jar standing on a teakwood table whose costliness, even to her uneducated eyes, was obvious. Suddenly she put on her spectacles, and still talking, rose, and walked slowly about the room glancing at the watercolors. By and by, just at the end of her harangue, to which Blair had listened in complete silence, she paused before a row of photographs on the mantelpiece, then, in the midst of a sentence, she broke off with an exclamation, leaned forward, and seizing a photograph, tore it in two, across the smiling face and the bare bosom, across the lovely, impudent line of the thigh, and flung it underfoot. Shame on you. To let your mother see a thing like that? I didn't ask my mother to see it. If you have thoughts like this, she said, Elizabeth did well to throw you over for David. Blair lifted one eyebrow with a glimmer of interest. Oh, David has got her, has he? At any rate, he's a man. He doesn't live like this. She made a contemptuous gesture, muddling with silks and paintings and pictures of bad women. What kind of a room is this for a man? Full of flowers and stinking jars and cushions and truck? It's more fit for a creature like that picture. She set her heel on the smiling face, than for a man. I ought never to have sent you here. I ought to have put you to puddling. She looked at him in growing agitation. My God, Blair, what are you, living this way, with silks and perfumery and clay baby dolls? You've got no guts to you. I didn't mind your making a fool of yourself. That's natural. Nobody can get to be a man till he's been a fool. But this, she stood there, with one hand on the mantelpiece beside the row of photographs and bits of carving and little silver trinkets, and looked at him in positive fright. And you are my son, she said. The torrent of her angry shame suddenly swept Blair's manhood of 24 years away. Her very power stripped him bare as a baby. It almost seemed as if she had sucked his masculinity out of him and incorporated it into herself. He stood there like a cringing schoolboy expecting to be whipped. One of the men gave me that picture. You ought to have slapped his face. Listen to me. You are going to be looked after. Do you hear me? You are going to be watched. Do you understand? She gathered up the whole row of photographs, innocent and offensive together, and threw them into the fire. You are going to walk straight, or you are coming home, and going to work. It was a match to gunpowder. In an instant Blair's temper, the terrific temper of the uniformly and lazily amiable man, flashed into furious words. Stammering with rage, he told her what he thought of her. To record his opinion is not for edification. Even Sarah Maitland flinched before it. She left him with a bang. She saw the dean again, and her recommendations of espionage were so extreme and so unwise that he found himself taking Blair's part in his effort to save the young man from the most insolent intrusion upon his privacy. She went back to Mercer in a whirl of anger but in somber silence. She had scorched and stung under the truths her son told her about herself. She had bled under the lies she had told him as to her feeling for him. She looked 10 years older for that hour in his room. But she had nothing to say. She told poor, frightened Nanny that she had seen Master Blair. She added that he was a fool. To Robert Ferguson she was a little more explicit. Blair has not been behaving himself. He's in debt. He has been gambling. See that all these bills are paid. Tell Watson to give him $100 more a month. I won't have him running in debt in this way. Now what about the Duluth order? Chapter 12. Mr. Ferguson made no protest in regard to Blair's increased allowance. If his mother wants to ruin him, it isn't my business, he said. The fact was, he had not recovered from his astonished resentment at Sarah Maitland's joke in Mrs. Ritchie's parlor. He thought about it constantly, and asked himself whether he did not owe his neighbor an apology of some kind. The difficulty was to know what kind, for after all he was perfectly innocent. Such an idea never entered my head, he thought angrily, but of course, if there has been anything in my conduct to put it into Mrs. Maitland's head, I ought to be thrashed. Perhaps I'd better not go in next door more than 2 or 3 times a week? So, for once, Robert Ferguson was distinctly out with his employer, and when she told him to see that Blair had $100 more a month, he said, in his own mind, be hanged to him. What difference does it make to me if she ruins him? And held his tongue until the next day. Then he barked out a remonstrance, I suppose you know your own business, but if I had a boy I wouldn't increase his allowance because he was in debt. I want to keep him from getting in debt again, she explained, her face falling into troubled lines. If you will allow me to say so, having been a boy myself, that's not the way to do it. Sarah Maitland flung herself back in her chair and struck the desk with her fist. I am at my wits' end to know what to do about him. My idea has been to make a man of him, by giving him what he wants, not making him fuss over 5-cent pieces. He's had everything. He's never heard no in his life. And yet, look at him. That's the trouble with him. He's had too much. He needs a few no's. But he's like most rich boys. There isn't one rich man's son in 10 who is worth his salt. If he were my boy, said Robert Ferguson, with that infallibility which everybody feels in regard to the way other people's children should be brought up, if he were my son, I'd put him to work this summer. Mrs. Maitland blew her lips out in a great sigh, then nibbled her forefinger, staring with blank eyes straight ahead of her. She was greatly perplexed. I'll think it over, she said. I'll think it over. Hold on. What's your hurry? I want to ask you something. Your neighbor there, Mrs. Ritchie, seems to be a very attractive woman, fair and 40, as the saying is, only I guess she's nearer 50? But she's mighty good looking, whatever her age is. The color came into Robert Ferguson's face. This time he was really offended. Mrs. Maitland was actually venturing. I have never noticed her looks, he said stiffly, and rose. It just struck me when I caught you in there the other day, she ruminated. What do you know about her? Buried deep in the casual question was another question, but Robert Ferguson did not hear it. She was not going to venture. He was so relieved that he was instantly himself again. He told her briefly what little he knew. Mrs. Ritchie was a widow, husband dead many years. I have an idea he was a crooked stick, more from what she hasn't said than what she has said. There's a friend of hers I meet once in a while at her house, a Dr. King, and he intimated to me that her husband was a bad lot. It appears he hurt their child when he was drunk. She never forgave him. I don't blame her, I'm sure. The baby died. It was after the death of the husband that she adopted David. She has no relations apparently, some friends in Old Chester, I believe. This Dr. King is one of them. Is she going to marry him? Mrs. Maitland said. There might be objections on the part of the present incumbent, he said, with his meager smile. Mrs. Maitland admitted that the doctor's wife presented difficulties, but perhaps she'll die, she said, cheerfully. I'm interested to know that Mrs. Ritchie has friends. I was wondering, she did not say what she wondered. She's a nice woman, Robert Ferguson, and a good woman, and a good-looking woman, too, fair and well, say 50. And if you had any sense. But this time Robert Ferguson really did get out of the office. His advice about Blair, however, seemed superfluous. So far as behavior went, Mrs. Maitland had no further occasion to increase his allowance. His remaining months in the university were decorous enough, though his scholarship was no credit to him. He squeaked through, as he expressed it to his sister, gaily, when she came east to see him graduate, 3 years behind the class in which he had entered college. But as to his conduct, that domiciliary visit had hardened him into a sort of contemptuous common sense. And his annoyed and humiliated manhood, combined with his aesthetic taste, sufficed, also, to keep things fairly peaceful when he was at home, which was rarely for more than a week or 2 at a time. Quarrels with his mother had become excruciating experiences, like discords on the piano. They set his teeth on edge, though they never touched his heart. To avoid them, he would, he told Nanny, chuckling at her horror, lie like the devil. His lying, however, was nothing more serious than a careful and entirely insincere politeness, but it answered his purpose, and rows, as he called them, were very rare, although, indeed, his mother did her part in avoiding them, too. To Sarah Maitland, a difference with her son meant a pang at the very center of her being, her maternity. Her heart was seared by it, but her taste was not offended because she had no taste. So, for differing reasons, peace was kept. The next fall, after a summer abroad, Blair went back to the university and took 2 or 3 special courses. Also, he began to paint rather seriously, all of which was his way of putting off the evil day of settling down in Mercer. Meantime, life grew quite vivid to his sister. Elizabeth had once said that Nanny was born an old maid, and certainly these tranquil, gently useless years of being very busy about nothing, and living quite alone with her stepmother, had emphasized in her a simplicity and literalness of mind that was sometimes very amusing to the other 3 friends. At any rate, hers was a pallid little personality. Perhaps it could not have been anything else in the household of a woman like Sarah Maitland, with whom, domestically, it was always either peace or a sword. Nanny was incapable of anything but peace. "You are afraid, Cat," Elizabeth used to tell her, "but you're a perfect dear." "Nanny is unscrupulously good," Blair said once, and her soft stubbornness in doing anything she conceived to be her duty warranted his criticism. But during the first year that David and Elizabeth were engaged, her stagnant existence in the silent old house began to stir. Little shocks of reality penetrated the gentle primness of her thought, and she came creeping out into the warmth and sunshine of other people's happiness. Indeed, her shy appreciation of the lovers' experiences became almost an experience of her own, so closely did she nestle to all their emotions. It was a real blow to her when it was decided that David should enter a Philadelphia hospital as an intern. "Won't he be at home even for the long vacations?" Nanny asked, anxiously. When she was told that hospitals did not give vacations, her only consolation was that she would have to console Elizabeth. But when Robert Ferguson heard what was going to happen, he had nothing to console him. "I'll have a lovesick girl on my hands," he complained to Mrs. Ritchie. "You'll have to do your share of it," he barked at her. He had come in through the green door in the garden wall, with a big clump of some perennial in his hands, and a trowel under one arm. "Peonies have to be thinned out in the fall," he said grudgingly, "and I want to get rid of this lot. Where shall I put 'em?" It was a warm October afternoon, and Mrs. Ritchie, who had been sitting on the stone bench under the big hawthorn in her garden, reading, until the dusk hid her page, looked up gratefully. "You are robbing yourself. I believe that is your precious white peony?" "It's only half of it, and I get as much good out of it here as in my own garden," he grunted. He was sitting on his heels digging a hole big enough for a clump of peonies with a trowel, so no wonder he grunted. "Besides, it improves my property to plant perennials. My next tenant may appreciate flowers," he ended, with the reproving significance which had become a joke between them. "Oh," said Mrs. Ritchie, sighing, "I don't like to think of that next tenant." He looked up at her a little startled. "What do you mean? You are not going to Philadelphia with David next April? Why, you didn't suppose I would let David go alone?" "What? You will leave Mercer?" he said. In his dismayed astonishment he dropped his trowel and stood up. "Will you please tell me why I should stay in Mercer, when David is in Philadelphia?" Robert Ferguson was silent. Then he tramped the earth in around the roots of the white peony, and said, sullenly, "It never occurred to me that you would go, too. You'll have to be extra nice to Elizabeth when we are not here, Mrs. Ritchie instructed him. David's mother was very anxious to be nice to Elizabeth herself, which was a confession, though she did not know it, of her old misgivings as to David's choice. "Be nice?" "I," said Mr. Ferguson, and snorted. "Did you ever know me nice?" "Always," she said, smiling. But he would not smile. He went back to his garden for some more roots. When he returned with a wedge taken from his bed of lemon lilies, he said crossly, "David can manage his own affairs. He doesn't need apron strings. I think I've mentioned that to you before?" "I think I recall some such reference," she admitted, her voice trembling with friendly amusement. But he went on growling and barking, "Foolish woman. To try the experiment at your age, of living in a strange place." At that she laughed outright. "That is the nicest way in the world to tell a friend you will miss her." Robert Ferguson did not laugh. In fact, as the winter passed and the time drew near for the move to be made, nobody laughed very much. Certainly not the 2 young people. Since David had left the medical school he had worked in Mercer's infirmary, and now they both felt as if the world would end for them when they ceased to see each other several times a day. David did his best to be cheerful about it. In fact, with that common sense of his which his engagement had accentuated, he was almost too cheerful. The hospital service would be a great advantage, he said, so great that perhaps the 3 years engagement to which they were looking forward, because David's finances would probably not be equal to a wife before that, the 3 years might be shortened to 2. But to be parted for 2 years, it was practically parting, for visits don't amount to anything. It's tough, said David. It's terrific, Elizabeth said. Oh, well, David reminded her, 2 years is a lot better than 3. It was curious to see how love had developed these two young creatures. Elizabeth had sprung into swift and glowing womanhood. With triumphant candor her conduct confessed that she had forgotten everything but love. She showed her heart to David and to her little world, as freely as a flower that has opened overnight, a rose, still wet with dew, that bears a warm and fragrant bosom to the sun. David had matured, too, but his maturity was of the mind rather than the body. Manhood suddenly fell upon him like a cloak, and because his sense of humor had always been a little defective, it was a somewhat heavy cloak, which hid and even hampered the spontaneous freedom of youth. He was deeply and passionately in love, but his face fell into lines of responsibility rather than passion, lines, even, of care. He grew markedly older. He thought incessantly of how soon he would be able to marry, and always in connection with his probable income and his possible expenses. Helena Ritchie was immensely proud of this sudden, serious manhood, but Elizabeth's uncle took it as a matter of course. Had he not, himself, ceased to be an ass at 20? Why shouldn't David Ritchie show some sense at 25? As for Elizabeth, she simply adored. Perhaps she was, once in a while, a little annoyed at the rather ruthless power with which David would calmly override some foolish wish of hers, and sometimes there would be a gust of temper, but it always yielded at his look or touch. When he was not near her, when she could not see the speechless passion in his eyes or feel the tremor of his lips when they answered the demand of hers, then the anger lasted longer. Once or twice, when he was away from home, his letters, with their laconic taking of her love for granted, made her sharply displeased, but when he came back and kissed her, she forgot everything but his arms. Curiously enough, the very completeness of her surrender kept him so entirely reverent of her that people who did not know him might have thought him cold. But Elizabeth knew. She knew his love, even when, as she fulminated against the misery of being left alone, David merely said, briefly, oh, well, 2 years is a lot better than 3. The 2 years of absence were to begin in April. It was in February that Robert Ferguson was told definitely just when his tenant would terminate her lease. He received the news in absolute silence. Mrs. Ritchie's note came at breakfast. He read it, then went into his library and shut the door. He sat down at his writing table, his hands in his pockets, an unlighted cigar between his teeth. He sat there nearly an hour. Then, throwing the cigar into his wastebasket, he knocked his glasses off with a bewildered gesture. Well, I'll be hanged, he said, softly. It was at that moment that he forgave Mrs. Maitland her outrageous joke of more than a year before. I've always known that woman was no fool, he said, smiling ruefully at the remembrance of his anger at Sarah Maitland's advice. It was darned good advice, he said, but he looked positively dazed. And I've always said I wouldn't give life the chance to play another trick on me. He reflected, well, I won't. This is no silly love affair, it's good common sense. 10 minutes later, as he started for his office, he caught sight of his face in the mirror in the hall. He had lifted one hand to take his hat from the rack, but as he suddenly saw himself, he stood stock still, with upraised arm and extended fingers. Robert Ferguson had probably not been really aware of his reflection in a looking glass for 25 years. He saw now a lean, lined, sad face, a morose droop of thin and bitter lips. He saw grey hair standing up stiffly above a careworn forehead. He saw kind, troubled eyes. And as he looked, he frowned. I'm an ugly cuss, he said to himself, sighing, and I look 60. In point of fact, he was nearly 50. But so is she, he added, defiantly, and took down his hat. Only, she looks 40. And then he thought of Mrs. Maitland's fair and 50, and smiled, in spite of himself. Yes, she is rather good looking, he admitted. And indeed she was. Mrs. Ritchie's quiet life with her son had kept her forehead smooth, and her eyes the color of a brook which loiters in shady places over last year's leaves, softly clear. There was a gentle placidity about her. The curious, shy hesitation, the deep, half-frightened sadness, which had been so marked when her landlord knew her first, had disappeared, Sometimes she even showed soft gaieties of manner or speech which delighted her moody neighbor to the point of making him laugh. And laughing had all the charm of novelty to poor Robert Ferguson. I never dreamed of her going away, he said to himself. Well, yes, certainly Mrs. Maitland had some sense, after all. When, a week later, blundering and abrupt, he referred to Mrs. Maitland's sense, Mrs. Ritchie could not at first understand what he was talking about. She knew more than you gave her credit for. I thought you gave her credit for knowing everything. Oh, you don't want me to leave Mercer? I don't see the connection. I don't know everything, but you are very flattering, I'm sure. I am a good tenant, I suppose? Please don't go. She laughed at what she thought was his idea of a joke, then said, with half a sigh, that she did not know anyone in Philadelphia. When David isn't at home I shall be pretty lonely, she said. Please don't go, he said again, in a low voice. They were sitting before the fire in Mrs. Ritchie's parlor. The glass doors of the plant room were open, that plant room, which had been his first concession to her, and the warm air of the parlor was fragrant with blossoming hyacinths. There was a little table between them, with a bowl of violets on it and a big lamp. Robert Ferguson rose, and stood with his hands behind him, looking down at her. His hair, in a stiff brush above his forehead, was quite grey, but his face in its unwonted emotion seemed quivering with youth. He knocked off his glasses irritably. I never know how to say things, he said, in a low voice, but please don't go. Mrs. Ritchie stared at him in amazement. I think we'd better get married, he said. Mr. Ferguson. I think I've cared about you ever since you came here, but I am such a fool I didn't know it until Mrs. Maitland said that absurd thing last fall. I don't know what you mean, she parried, breathlessly. At any rate, please don't say anything more about it. I have to say something more. He sat down again with the air of one preparing for a siege. I've got several things to say. First, I want to find out my chances. You haven't any. His face moved. He put on his glasses carefully, with both hands. Mrs. Ritchie, is there anyone else? If so, I'll quit. I know you will answer straight, you are not like other women. Is there anybody else? That old Chester doctor who comes to see you once in a while. I understand he's a widower now. Wife's just died, and if... There is nobody, never anybody. Ah, he said, triumphantly, then frowned. If your attachment to your husband makes you say I haven't any chance, but it can't be that. Her eyes suddenly dilated. Why not? Why do you say it can't be that? She said in a frightened voice. I somehow got the impression, forgive me if I am saying anything I oughtn't to, but I had kind of an idea that you were not especially happy with him. She was silent. But even if you were, he went on, it is so many years. I don't mean to offend you, but a woman isn't faithful to a memory for so many years. He looked at her incredulously. Not even you, I think. Such a thing is possible, she told him coldly. She had grown very pale. But it is not because of my husband that I say I shall never marry again. He interrupted her. If it isn't a dead man nor a live man that's ahead of me, then it seems to me you can't say I haven't any chance, unless I am personally offensive to you? There was an almost childlike consternation in his eyes. Am I? Of course I know I am a bear. Oh, please don't say things like that. She protested. A bear? You? Why, you are just my good, kind friend and neighbor, but... Ah, he said, that scared me for a minute. Well, when I understood what was the matter with me, I didn't understand until about a week ago. I said to myself, if there's nobody ahead of me, that woman shall be my wife. Of course, I am not talking sentimentalities to you. We are not David and Elizabeth. I'm 50, and you are not far from it. But I'm hard hit, Mrs. Ritchie. His voice trembled, and he twitched off his glasses with more than usual ferocity. Mrs. Ritchie rose. Mr. Ferguson, she said, gently, I do appreciate the honor you do me, but... Don't say a thing like that. It's foolish, he interrupted, frowning. What honor is it, to a woman like you, to have an ugly, bad-mannered fellow like me want you for a wife? Why, how could I help it? How could any man help it? I don't know what Dr. King is thinking of, that he isn't sitting on your doorsteps waiting for a chance to ask you. I ought to have asked you long ago. I can't imagine why I didn't, except that I supposed we would go on always living next door to each other. And I thought anything like this was over for me. Mrs. Ritchie, please sit down, and let me finish what I have to say. There is no use, Mr. Ferguson, she said, but she sat down, her face falling into lines of sadness that made her look curiously old. There isn't anybody ahead of me, so far, so good. Now as to my chances, of course I realize that I haven't any, today. But there's tomorrow, Mrs. Ritchie, and the day after tomorrow. There's next week, and next year, and I don't change. Look how slow I was in finding out that I wanted you, it's taken me all these years. What a poor, dull fool I am. Well, I know it now, and you know it, and you don't personally dislike me. So perhaps someday, his harsh face was suddenly almost beautiful, someday you'll be my wife. He said, under his breath. He had no idea that he was talking sentimentalities, he would have said he did not know how to be sentimental. But his voice was the voice of youth and passion. She shook her head. No, she said, quietly, I can't marry you, Mr. Ferguson. But you are generally so reasonable, he protested, astonished and wistful. Why, it seems to me that you must be willing, after a while. Here we are, two people getting along in years, and our children have made a match of it, and we are used to each other. That's a very important thing in marriage. It's just plain common sense, after David is on his own legs in the hospital, for us to join forces. Perhaps in the early summer? I won't be unreasonably urgent. Surely, he was gaining confidence from his own words, surely you must see how sensible. Involuntarily, perhaps through sheer nervousness, she laughed. Mrs. Maitland's sensible arrangement. No, Mr. Ferguson, please let us forget all about this. He gave his snort of a laugh. Forget? Now that isn't sensible. No, you dear, foolish woman, whatever else we do, we shall neither of us forget this. This is one of the things a man and woman don't forget. In his earnestness he pushed aside the bowl of violets on the table between them, and caught her hand in both of his. I'm going to get you yet, he said, he was as eager as a boy. Before she could reply, or even draw back, David opened the parlor door, and stood aghast on the threshold. It was impossible to mistake the situation. The moment of sharp withdrawal between the two on either side of the table announced it. Without the uttering of a word, David caught his breath. Robert Ferguson could have wrung the intruder's neck, but Mrs. Ritchie clutched at her son's presence with a gasp of relief. Oh, David. I thought you were next door? I was, David said, briefly. I came in to get a book for Elizabeth. We were talking, Mrs. Ritchie said, trying to laugh. Mr. Ferguson, standing with his back to the fire, was slowly putting on his glasses. But we had finished our discussion, she ended breathlessly. For the moment, Mr. Ferguson said, significantly, and set his jaw. Well, David, have you and Elizabeth decided when she is to come and see us in Philadelphia? Mrs. Ritchie asked, her voice still trembling. She says she'll come east whenever Mr. Ferguson can bring her, David said, rummaging among the books on the table. But it's a pity to wait as long as that, he added, and the hint in his words was inescapable. Robert Ferguson did not take hints. I think I can manage to come pretty soon, he retorted.